Dust doesn't fall in that town. It hangs like it's been waiting on this one particular morning longer than anybody standing under it. 6 horses. 6 long shadows stretched thin across the packed dirt, every last one of them pointing the same direction at a woman standing alone outside the feed store. She's small, narrow through the shoulders. A gray dress gone pale from too many washings. Her hands are empty except the right one isn't resting easy at her side. It's hovering 2 inches off her hip, off a place where a farmer's widow ought to have nothing but a torn apron pocket and 11 cents to her name. The man out front grins down from the saddle. A thin white scar cuts clean through his left eyebrow. "Ma'am, this don't have to go hard." Behind her a screen door creaks open. A boy's voice cracks through it, fear dressed up as courage. She doesn't blink, his hand drops toward his gun, hers is already there. Dust does not fall in Larkspur Hollow. It hangs over the street like it already knows what's coming, like it's been waiting on this one particular morning longer than anybody standing underneath it. 6 men. 6 horses. 6 long shadows stretched thin across the packed dirt of Main Street, every one of them pointing straight at a woman standing alone outside the feed store. She has small, narrow shoulders. A gray dress gone pale from years of washing. A shawl that doesn't sit right on her, not the way a rich woman's shawl sits. Her hands are empty. Always empty. That's what men like these count on when they ride into a town looking for an easy except her right hand isn't resting easy at her side, it's hovering 2 inches off her hip. 2 inches from a place where a farmer's widow should have nothing but a torn apron pocket and 11 cents to her name. The man in front, big through the chest, a thin white scar cutting clean through his left eyebrow, grins down at her from the saddle. "Ma'ams," slow. Like a threat wearing a hat. She doesn't answer. Doesn't blink either. Somewhere behind her a screen door creaks open, and a boy's voice cracks through it, fear dressed up as courage. Stay inside, Toby." Her voice does not shake. That's the first thing anybody standing on that street will remember, years on. Telling this story to grandson, gathered close around a stove in December. Her voice did not shake. The big man's hand drops toward his gun. Hers is already there. Hold that. Hold that image a moment. One woman alone, faster than 6 armed men. Faster than every last thing this town ever believed about her, because to understand how she came to be standing in that street, on that particular morning, with that many guns leveled at her heart, you have to go back 8 months. 8 months before that dust ever hung still enough to matter. Before any of it. Before the fire that would come. Before the men with the scarred eyebrow and the empty promises rode up her drive the first time. There was just a farm. 200 acres of hard Wyoming dirt at the edge of a town called Larkspur Hollow, out where the plains start climbing toward the bighorns and the wind never once, not a single day of the year, learns how to be gentle. Zarelda Hargrove did not go by Zarelda. Hadn't since she was 7 years old, and her own father decided the name was too big a load for a girl who could barely pronounce it herself, so it shrank down to Z, 2 letters. Easy to shout across a field. Easier still to say fast when something had gone wrong. She was 26 years old that spring of 1885, 26 and a widow. 26, and already, in the quiet reckoning of Larkspur Hollow, something close to finished. Because that's how the town had come to see her. Not cruel about it, worse than cruel. Pitying. The women at church pressed her hand a beat too long after service, murmuring "bless your heart" and such a shame in voices soft with a kind of sympathy that came with an expiration date stamped right on it. The men tipped their hats and looked past her shoulder, already doing the arithmetic of how long before the widow Hargrove gave up that farm. Before she sold it cheap to whoever offered first. Before she packed herself off back east, where a woman alone was supposed to go and be somebody else's problem. They did not know her. Didn't know that before sunrise, 6 mornings out of 7, she walked the fence line of her father's old grazing pasture with a rifle broken open over her arm, checking for coyote sign. Checking for anything that moved wrong in the gray light. Didn't know she could put a bullet through a tin can at 40 paces, without letting her breath so much as catch. Didn't know because she'd spent 7 long years in this town making very, very sure that they didn't. Which was its own particular kind of exhausting. Being invisible on purpose. Making yourself smaller than you actually are every single day. Because being your true size had gotten people killed before. Had gotten people she loved killed before. That morning, the one that started the real unraveling, not the dust in the street ending but the true beginning. Z was up before the sun, same as always. Coffee boiling black and bitter on the stove. Bread from the day before gone hard enough to need soaking. Boots rizzled twice already and needing it again. Outside, the barn door groaned on its hinge. Needed oil. Everything on this farm needed something, and there was only one pair of hands left standing to give it. Her hands, because that was the arithmetic of widowhood nobody ever warned a woman about. Not the grief. Grief you expected. Grief got preached at you your whole life. In sermon, in olds, in the black dress your own grandmother wore 20 years running after your grandfather passed. What nobody told you about was the arithmetic underneath it. 200 acres, one pair of hands. 24 hours to a day, every last one of them already spoken for before the coffee had even finished boiling. She stepped out onto the porch with her cup and looked east, where the sky was doing that particular thing it did over Wyoming in early spring, turning the color of a healing bruise, purple bleeding slow into rose, rose thinning out into a hard gold right at the very edge of the world. Beautiful. She almost let herself think it all the way through. Almost let herself stand there one full minute and just look at something beautiful without running numbers behind it. Then Toby's cough rattled through the thin wall behind her, and the minute ended, because everything ended the moment somebody needed something from her. That was the other thing about this particular life. It did not pause. Did not care one bit that a sunrise deserved a whole minute of a person's undivided attention. It simply kept coming same as it always had. Tobias Wren was 16 years old, all elbows and stubborn silent, and he'd been living in the Hargrove barn loft 4 months running before Z finally quit, pretending she hadn't noticed the missing eggs. The blanket dragged up into the hayloft every single night. She hadn't asked where his people were. Hadn't needed to. There was a particular kind of quiet that orphans carried around with them, and she recognized it the way a person recognizes their own handwriting on an old letter. So instead of asking, she'd simply started leaving a second plate out at supper. Left it right there on the table, said nothing about it. Waited 3 nights running before he finally came down and sat at it. Silent eyes locked on the food like it might vanish the second he looked away. He never once explained himself. She never once made him. That was the whole arrangement, unspoken. The way most of the good things in a hard life seemed to work themselves out, not through some grand sit-down conversation, but through 2 people quietly deciding, without ever saying so, not to be alone in the exact same direction anymore. "You're up early," she said, now, as he came out onto the porch, a blanket still wrapped round his shoulders like a cape 3 sizes too big for him. Couldn't sleep. Coyotes again? Something. He squinted east, toward the tree line where the light hadn't tried reach yet.
Bird rider.
Real late. Z's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Riders didn't come close. Just he shrugged, the particular shrug of a boy his age trying hard to seem unbothered and failing at it. Heard him out on the county road. Stopped a spell. She set the cup down slow on the porch rail. Because riders on that county road at night meant nothing. Could mean nothing at all. Ranch hands riding home late off a card game in town. A rider carrying mail through the dark to make an early morning delivery. A dozen ordinary explanations, and every last one of them true 9 times out of 10 Except this made the 4th time in 2 weeks Toby had mentioned riders in the dark, and except Emmett Roark had already sent a man up her drive 11 days back with an offer she still hadn't answered. And except there was a particular stillness that settled over a piece of land right before somebody made up their mind to take it from you. A stillness Z had felt once before, a long time ago, in a house that no longer existed anywhere but memory, and her body had never once fully forgotten the shape of it. "Go on and get the eggs," she said, keeping her voice easy. "Light. I'll finish up the coffee." Toby went. He always went when she used that particular voice, flat, unbothered, the one that meant she'd already decided something and had no intention of saying what. She waited until the barn door swallowed him whole. Then she went back inside, past the stove, past the table, toward the locked chest sitting at the foot of her bed that hadn't been opened in 11 months. Her hand hovered over the latch the exact way it would hover Hollow Street 8 months from that very morning, close, not touching. Not yet, she left it closed. Not today, she told herself. Not yet. She would tell herself that same lie in that same worn, smooth voice, more than a few more times before that summer was through. Each time the lie would come out a little thinner than the last. The offer had come on a Tuesday, which Z would later decide was fitting, because nothing good had ever once happened to her on a Tuesday. Her mother had died on a Tuesday, her father's letters had stopped arriving on a Tuesday 12 years back now, and never once started again. So when a rider came up the drive on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting a horse far too fine for a working ranch hand, wearing a coat far too clean for honest dust, she already had a bad feeling settling cold and low in her stomach before he'd so much as opened his mouth. He didn't get down off the horse. That was the first insult, though it took her a beat to name it as one. A man who respects you dismounts to speak with you. A man who doesn't talks down at you from the saddle, same as he'd talk to a fence post. He happened to be giving directions to Mrs. Hargrove. That's right, name's Tatum. I work for Mr. Emmett Roark. He let that sit a moment the way men did when they expected a name alone to do half their talking for them. Roark owned 11,000 acres of grazing land east of the Hollow, more cattle than most folks could count in a working week, and as of the last 2 years every waterhole between the Hollow and the base of the mountains that didn't happen to sit square on somebody else's deed. Z's farm held one of the last ones. Mr. Roark, Tatum went on, is prepared to make a generous offers. That creek running your north pasture, that creek runs my whole farm, Mr. Tatum. Not just the north pasture. Generous offer, he repeated, like saying it twice might make it true. More cash money than you'd see farming this whole ground in 5 years running. He smiled at that. Didn't reach his eyes. Didn't try very hard. Folks generally don't. Z stood very still on her own porch, in front of her own house, and felt something old and cold uncoil slow in her chest, a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in a very long while, because feeling it meant remembering exactly where she'd first learned the shape of it. You tell Mr. Roark, she said, that I thank him kindly for his interest and that my answer is no. Something flickered behind Tatum's eyes, not anger, not yet. Something closer to surprise, the particular surprise of a man who has never once in his whole grown life been told no by a woman standing alone on a porch with her arms folded and not a gun in sight. You sure about that? Wasn't a question. Was a door, held open one breath longer in case she wanted to walk herself back through it. She didn't, I'm sure. He touched his hat, mocking, not polite, and turned his horse. We'll be back around, Mrs. Hargrove. She watched him ride off down the drive, dust rising thin behind his horse like something trying to catch up and never quite managing it, and she stood there a long while after he'd gone, arms still folded, jaw still set tight, because we'll be back around wasn't a farewell. It was a promise. Amos would have known what to do. That thought came to her sometimes, uninvited, right in the middle of the most ordinary tasks, hanging the wash, mending a fence rail, salting meat down for winter, and it always landed the same particular way. Soft going in, sharp coming back out, same as a splinter. Amos Hargrove had been dead 8 months by then. Found in the equipment shed on a gray October morning, pinned beneath the plow he'd been repairing. The official word from the county coroner, reading out exactly what it looked like on the surface. Accident. Farm accident. Tragic. Not uncommon in a country this hard. Z had believed it for a while anyway. Grief has habit of accepting the very first explanation it's handed, because grief is already too busy drowning to go hunting up reasons to drown any harder. She'd buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the north pasture, worn black through the customary months, and told herself the world was simply, senselessly cruel seasons, and that was the whole of it. Amos had been a quiet man, steady, not given to big talk or bigger plans, which had suited her fine. On account of Z had grown up around a man whose own big talk and bigger plans had gotten him killed in the end. Amos farmed the way he lived, careful, deliberate, checking every gate twice before he trusted it, which was exactly what nagged at her now, 4 days after Tatum's visit, standing alone in the equipment shed with the afternoon light slanting gold and dusty through the gaps between the boards. Because a man who checked every gate twice did not get careless enough, all of a sudden, to let a plow crush the life clean out of him. She hadn't let herself think that particular thought in the full 8 months since. Hadn't let it form all the way, hadn't let it sit still long enough to look it dead in the eye. But it was sitting there now, plain as day, and it would not leave.
Z.
She turned. Hiram Beckett stood in the shed doorway, hat in his 2 hands, looking older than his 50-some years, the way he'd been looking lately. Hiram had farmed the section next to Amos's family land for 20 years running. Had stood up at Amos and Zid. Had been one of 6 men who carried the coffin up that long hillside. Hiram, she wiped her hands down her apron, though they weren't dirty in the first place. Just something to do with them. Didn't hear you right up, wasn't trying to be quiet about it. He turned the hat over once in his hands. Twice, sometimes hisps up towards something he didn't much want to say. Got a minute? For you always. He didn't smile back at that the way he usually have. That more than anything else told her plain this wasn't any kind of social call. I've been meaning to come by, he said. Meaning to for a good while now. Kept telling myself it wasn't my place. Kept not. Amos was gone and gone was gone, and no good ever come of stirring up. Her voice had gone very quiet, very still. Say it. He looked at the plow, that same plow. Repaired now, back in use, sitting in the corner of the shed like nothing at all had ever happened there. That plow, he said. The one they found him under. What about it? I helped Amos fix that linkage myself. Month before it happened, showed him how to check the pin was seated right, on account of he'd had trouble with it slipping before. Hiram's jaw worked. That man checked things twice, see? 3 times some days. I used to tease him something fierce over it. I know. So when they told me a pin worked loose and a whole plow come down on him while he was under it, Hiram shook his head like the very motion of it hurt him. I didn't say nothing, told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself grief makes a man careless, makes him forget his own habits sometimes. He finally lifted his eye, and they were wet and old, and ashamed. But it's been eating at me 8 months, see? 8 solid months, and I got to say it out loud to somebody besides myself before I carry it into my own grave with me. The shed had gone very quiet. Even the wind, which never once stopped in this country, seemed to have found itself somewhere else to be for a moment. Say what, Hiram? Her voice had dropped so low it was barely a voice at all anymore. Say what you came here to say. I don't believe it was an accident. The words landed the way a gunshot lands inside an empty church, loud in a place built for quiet, wrong in a place built for peace. Z did not gasp, did not cry out. Something in her, something old, something inherited, something trained into her long before she was old enough to understand what training even meant. Sims, and very cold, and very, why, she said. Not a question. 2 days before he died, Hiram said, Amos come by my place, wasn't like him riding out just to talk, no chores excuse for it at all, sat on my porch a long while, didn't say much at first. Then he told me a man had come around. Said he turned him down flat same as always. Z's hands had gone cold clear through Roark's man. Didn't give a name. But Amos said. Hiram stopped himself, started again. He said the man told him folks who told Mr. Roark know had a particular way of changing their minds, or a way of not needing to know more. Silence thick and full, in a shed choked with dust and old iron and a repaired plow that had never once, not in Z's whole exhausted grief, looked like a murder weapon until this exact minute. 2 days, she said. 2 days later he was dead. Hiram's voice broke clean on the last word, and he had to look away from her, out through the doorway, toward the pasture, toward the creek that ran silver and stupid and unaware of everything it had already cost this family. I should have spoke sooner, I know that. I've hated myself for it every single day since, but I was scared, Z. Scared for my own place, my own family. And I told myself the dead don't, regardless of what I say. So what good would the saying do? You're saying it now? I'm saying it now. He finally met her eyes again, and there was something in his face close to pleading. On account of I heard Roark's man come around your place too. And I couldn't live with myself if I let the same exact thing happen twice and said nothing both times through. Z looked at the plow, looked at it the way a person looks at a stranger's face in a crowd right when they suddenly, impossibly, recognize it. 8 months of grief rearranged itself, right there in that shed, into something with sharper edges. Something with a shape to it now. Something with a name attached, even if that name was only a guess yet. Thank you, Hiram. Her voice had come steady. Too steady maybe, for a woman who'd just been told plain that her husband was murdered, but steady was a skill Z had learned a long time back. Under circumstances Hiram Beckett knew nothing about, and it came to her now the way an old comes to a person's shoulders in the season's first cold snap. Familiar. Necessary. Not entirely welcome, but exactly what the weather was demanding of her. You gonna go to the sheriff over it? I don't rightly know yet what I'm going to do. That was true, and it was also, in its own particular way, a lie, because somewhere underneath the grief, underneath the shock of it, a small cold voice that had gone silent 12 years back was starting up again. Very quietly. She didn't sleep that night, didn't even try to. Sat instead at the kitchen table long after Toby had gone up to the loft, a single candle burning low, and let herself think, really think, for the first time in the full 8 months, about the man she'd buried on that hillside. Amos Hargrove had never once asked her about her past. She'd noticed that early in their courtship and been grateful for it in a way she'd never fully examined until right now. Other men wanted stories. Wanted to know where a woman had come from, who her people were, why a girl with no family had shown up alone in Larkspur Hollow at 19 with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and her own 2 hands to her name. Ace had never once asked. She'd told herself back then that it was simply his nature. Quiet, incurious. A man content to take a person as they stood right in front of him, without ever going digging at the ground underneath their feet. Sitting at that table now, candle guttering low, Hiram's words looping over and over through her skull. She found herself wondering for the first time in 6 years of marriage, whether Amos's silence had ever truly been about her at all, or whether he'd simply already known. The thought was so large, she had to set it down a moment, the way a person sets down a crate too heavy to haul clear across a whole room in one single go. Because if Amos had known who she really was, if Amos had known what her father had been and what had happened to him in the end, then Amos's death wasn't only about water rights, it might be about her. She sat with that thought until the candle burned itself down to a stub, and the window went from black to that same bruised purple that had opened the morning before it, and somewhere in that long, terrible, clarifying night, Hargrove made a decision she had spent 12 whole years trying her level best to avoid making. She was done pretending to be small. Her father had taught her to shoot on a stretch of open range, not unlike the one running behind her own farmhouse now, though that range had belonged to an entirely different territory, an entirely different life, back when she was still Zarelda Doss and not yet anybody's widow. She was 9 years old the first time Nathaniel Doss ever put a revolver into her hand. Too heavy, she'd said, arms already trembling under the plain weight of it. It'll get lighter. Her father had crouched beside her in the grass, his big hands closing gentle over her small ones, adjusting grip the way another man might adjust a child's hands on a hymnal come Sunday. Everything heavy gets lighter, Z. You just got to carry it long enough. She hadn't understood him then, not really. Not the way she would come to, years and years later. He'd taught her the same way he taught most everything: patient, exacting, more interested in her understanding a thing all the way down than in her performing it quick for show. Stance came first. Weeks of nothing but stance before he'd even let her fire off a single round. Breathing came second. How to let the air out slow, and even how to find that still half-second between one heartbeat and the next where a hand went steady and the whole world went quiet around it. Why's it matter so much? She'd asked him once, maybe 11 by then. Frustrated clean through after a long afternoon of missing a tin can 20 times running. Why do I got to be good at this? Her father had gone quiet a long moment. The particular kind of quiet a grown man gets when a child's gone and asked him something too big for an easy answer. Because the world don't much care whether a body's a girl or a boy when it decides to turn cruel on them, he'd said finally, and I'd rather see you carry the means to answer that cruelty than pray your whole life. It never once comes looking for you. Did it come looking for you? Something had moved behind his eyes then, something old and tired that she'd been too young yet to put a name to. Once or twice was all he'd allowed. He never did explain to her exactly what he did for the Cattlemen's Association. He rode for a range detective, was the word she pieced together. Eventually, a man paid good money to track down rustlers and enforce the unwritten laws of grazing land, that the written laws hadn't yet caught up to. Dangerous work. Necessary work in the eyes of the men who paid for it. Deeply, bitterly resented work in the eyes of the men it was aimed square at. He'd come home some nights carrying new suskers he never once explained. Rode out some mornings before first light with a grim, careful quiet that Z learned, eventually, meant don't ask, not today, maybe not tomorrow either. Then the autumn she turned 14, he simply didn't come home at all. No body, no grave, not for years and years. Just a foreman riding up to the ranch house with his hat already off his head, already apologizing before he'd said a single solitary word, and a story about an ambush out on the North Range that never once added up right. No matter how many times young Z turned it over in her mind, through the long grieving nights that followed after, the Cattlemen's Association paid her mother a small settlement and called the whole affair a tragedy of the range. Life in that hard country moving right along the way it always did, indifferent clean through to any one family's private ruin. 2 years, her mother died too of grief. The old women in town used to whisper, though Z had come to suspect it was simpler and crueler than that. Bought by just plain deciding it was tired clear through of carrying so much weight without her father there anymore, to remind it that everything heavy does eventually get lighter, if a person only carries it long enough. At 16 Z had nothing left to her name. No family left living, no home left standing. Just a horse, a rifle her father had left behind, and a grim, quiet resolve she'd inherited from him without ever once meaning to. She drifted 3 years running. Worked as a hand on ranches, willing to take on a girl who could ride and shoot better than most of their own men, though she made good and sure never to show quite how much better. Learned the hard way. Across a handful of ugly encounters she did not care to remember in any detail. Exactly why her father had insisted so hard she learned to defend herself. At 19 she rode into Larkspur Hollow carrying a story about a family gone back east. A story nobody in town had any particular reason to doubt, and a determination hard as flint, Cold as this Wyoming wind itself, to bury Zarelda Doss so deep in that new ground that nobody, ever, would come looking for what little was left of Nathaniel Doss's only daughter. She'd done it too, 7 years of small, 7 years of quiet. 7 long years of letting a whole town believe she was nothing more than a farmer's wife with steady hands and an easy smile. On account of small women didn't get followed home by men with unfinished business trailing after them. Small women didn't get remembered at all. Sitting at her kitchen table 8 months into her widowhood, candle burned clean down to nothing, dawn creeping gray through the window glass, Z understood with the particular terrible clarity of a woman who has run plumb out of places, left to run to that small had just run out of road entirely. Roark's men came back on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Hiram Beckett stood in that equipment shed, and finally said the thing he'd been too afraid to say for 8 long months. They came at dusk, which Z would come to understand later was deliberate, dusk being a coward's hour, light enough still to see clear by, dark enough already to blur a face should any witness ever come asking questions after. 5 riders this time, Tatum out front, the same mocking half-smile riding right along with him like a second passenger in the saddle. Z was at the wells when she heard them coming, and she did not run for the house, did not hide herself away. Set the bucket down slow, wiped her hands down her apron, and turned to face the drive with her chin held level and her heart going hard and fast underneath a calm she'd spent 7 long years perfecting to a fine point. Evening, Mrs. Hargrove. Tatum didn't dismount this time either, none of them did. 5 men on 5 horses, looking down at one woman standing alone in her own farmyard, and Z understood, with a cold clarity, that the arithmetic of the whole moment had been designed on purpose. 5 against 1. That was the entire point of it. Not persuasion, plain intimidation, Mr. Tatum. Come to see if you'd reconsidered Mr. Roark's offer any. I told your Mr. Roark my answer already. Hasn't changed a bit. Tatum's smile thinned some. Man doesn't much care to hear no twice, ma'am. Then he's welcome to hear it a 3rd time should it suit him. Behind, the barn door creaked, and she heard Toby's footsteps stop dead just inside it. Smart boy. Staying back. Staying quiet. Close enough all the same to serve as a witness should one prove needed. One of the riders, young, with a jaw that hadn't yet made up its mind about growing a beard, leaned toward Tatum and murmured something Z couldn't quite catch. Tatum's jaw went tight. That's enough, Rafe. But the young one, Rafe, had already swung down off his horse, boots hitting the dirt with a swagger that told Z plenty about how this particular evening was fixing to go. He crossed the yard, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes running a long, insolent sweep over her that set every muscle in her body taut with something that wasn't fear at all. Was closer kin to memory. Pretty little thing to be sitting on land this valuable all by her lonesome, Rafe said. Close enough, now she could smell the whiskey riding under his words. Seems an awful waste, all this water going to a woman, can't hardly work it proper without a man to. Get back on your horse. Her voice didn't rise a single note. Didn't need to. Something underneath it, some old buried register her father had trained into her 12 years back on an open range that no longer existed anywhere but memory, cut clean through that yard sharper than assault ever could have. Rafe blinked, laughed, short and ugly, glancing back toward Tatum like he expected to be joined in on the joke of it. Or what, sweetheart? Or you'll find out. Silence. The particular kind that carries actual weight to it. The kind that makes horses shift their feet uneasy and makes men's hands drift, half without their own say-so, toward the grips of their guns, on account of some old animal part of the brain has already sensed something the thinking part hasn't yet caught up to. Rafe's hand moved first. Not fast, not by the standards of a man who truly knew what he was about, just a twitch, a half-inch shift toward his holster, meant only to threaten, not to draw, for real, the sort of move a bully makes purely to watch a woman flinch back from it. Z did not flinch. Z moved. It happened across a space of time too short for the eye to properly follow, too short for Rafe's whiskey-slowed mind to register until the whole of it was already finished and done. One moment her hands sat empty, apron-clad, folded loose at her side. The next, a revolver, small, well-worn, drawn clean from a holster hidden beneath the folds of her skirt, that not one of those 5 men had ever once thought to search for, hung leveled dead center at Rafe's chest, hammer already back, her stance as calm and rooted as a woman standing in Sunday church. Rafe froze solid. Every last one of the 4 men still mounted froze right alongside him, hands stopped dead halfway toward weapons they suddenly, urgently, did not want to go and finish reaching for. After all, I said, voice still level, still entirely unhurried, get back on your horse. For one long ringing moment nobody in that yard moved a single muscle. The whole place seemed to be holding its breath together, the horses, the fence posts, the last gold light dying slow behind the western ridge. Every bit of it suspended around one small woman with an old revolver and a stillness that had never once come out of 7 years on a Wyoming farm, had come from somewhere a great deal older than that. Rafe's eyes flicked toward Tatum. Tatum's jaw had gone tight, his own hand frozen an inch shy of his holster, running rapid and uncomfortable math on just how fast this particular woman's draw had truly been, and on whether 5 armed men genuinely held the advantage he'd assumed riding in that evening. Easy, Tatum said to him, to the whole 10-step yard around them all. Easy now. Rafe backed off, slow hands lifted just slightly, every last drop of swagger gone clean out of him. Z did not lower that gun until his boot found the stirrup, and his full weight settled back down into the saddle proper. Only then did Tatum finally speak again, and his voice had shed its mocking edge entirely. What replaced it was worse, a cold, calculating attention. The particular look of a man busy recalculating every last thing he'd thought he knew about the woman standing in front of him. You're a hard one to figure, Mrs. Hargrove. There's nothing much to figure. I asked you kindly the first time through. I'm asking a good deal less kindly now. Get off my land. Tatum studied her another long moment. Then he touched his hat, not mocking this time, and turned his horse around. This ain't finished, he said low, near to himself. Mr. Roark don't take kindly to being told no. And he surely don't take kindly at all to a woman drawing a gun down on his men. Then tell him I look forward to hearing exactly how kindly he takes it. The 5 riders left at a walk, unhurried, though every last line of their bodies betrayed just how badly they wanted that unhurried pace to read as something other than what it plainly was. Z stood in the yard long after the dust of their leaving had settled back down, revolver still loose but ready in her hand, heart going so hard she could feel every beat of it clear up in her throat. Behind, the barn door creaked the rest of the way open, and Toby stepped out, pale, wide-eyed, staring at her like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time all over again. His voice came out small. Where in God's name did you ever learn to do that? She looked down at the revolver still sitting in her hand, old, well oiled despite years spent hiding at the very bottom of a locked chest. Her father's revolver, though Toby didn't know that yet, and wouldn't, not for a while longer. Long story, she said. We got time? She almost laughed at that. Would have some other night, under some other set of stars, not tonight, she said instead, sliding the gun back into its hidden holster beneath her skirt with the practiced ease of a woman who had genuinely never stopped. Knowing how, go bar the barn door, I want you close by the house tonight. He didn't argue it. Something in her face, in her voice, told plain this wasn't a night built for arguing. As he moved off to obey, Z turned back toward the house, toward the porch, toward the locked chest at the foot of her bed that had sat closed 11 full months, and had just, without her fully deciding it on purpose, become impossible to leave closed a single day longer, because Tatum's parting words were still ringing loud in the cooling evening air behind her. This ain't finished. And for the first time in 7 long years of careful, deliberate smallness, some old, buried part of Zarelda Doss Hargrove found herself almost glad to hear it said out loud. The chest was cedar. Her father had built it with his own 2 hands, back when Z was still small enough to hide inside it during games she couldn't properly recall anymore, and the wood still carried the faint ghost of him, even now, pipe smoke, saddle leather, something underneath both of those she never once found the right word for except home. She knelt in front of it a long while before her fingers found the latch. Because opening it meant something significant. Men admitting outright that small hadn't worked after all. Men admitting that 7 years of careful, deliberate invisibility had been a kind of lie she'd told not only to Larkspur Hollow but to her own self as well. She opened it anyway. Onto folded quilt, moth-eaten at one corner, that her mother had sewn together the winter before she died. Beneath that a Bible, its spine cracked clean through. Her father's name inked on the flyleaf in handwriting so much like her own it startled her fresh every single time she laid eyes on it. Beneath that, wrapped close in oiled cloth, sat the second revolver. Twin to the one she'd drawn on Rafe not an hour before, a matched pair her father had carried, one on each hip, back when he rode proud for the Territorial Stockmen's Association and men twice his size crossed clean over to the other side of the street, sooner than meet his eye straight on. And beneath the guns, right at the very bottom, a small stack of letters, gone yellow with age, tied up tight with a leather cord gone brittle as old bone. Her hands shook taking them out. First time they'd shaken all evening long, steady enough to draw down on 5 armed men not an hour past. Unsteady now, faced with nothing more dangerous in the whole world than her own father's handwriting. The letters were old, older than she'd been expecting. Not written to her at all. Written to a man named Ezra Calder, a name Z recognized with a hard jolt, her father's oldest living friend. A lawman he'd ridden alongside 20 years running, before Calder hung up his badge for good and disappeared off somewhere north, up toward the mountains, to live out whatever measure of peace a man like that could still manage to find for himself. She had never once read these letters. Had found them once, as a girl of 14, going through her father's things after the foreman came up the drive, with his hat already off his head, but her own mother had taken them clean out of her hands before she'd read past the very first line. Said not, sweetheart, not yet, and locked them away safe inside this very chest. Not yet had turned somehow into the particular way grief let 1,000 small postponements slowly calcified down into permanent silence. Z untied the cord now, at last. The first letter carried a date 18 months before her father disappeared for good. She read it slow, in the low candlelight, the words rearranging 12 full years of assumption into something else entirely. Ezra Roark's men getting bolder by the week. 3 homesteads burned out past the North Fork this month alone, and the association keeps looking clean the other way, on account of half the boards already sitting square on Emmett Roark's payroll one way or another. I've told them plain what I found. Told them the fires ain't accident, same as the cattle deaths ain't disease. They don't want to hear it. Money's already gone and decided what the truth's going to be, and I'm just a fool standing dumb in the way of it now. Got a bad feeling, old friend? Not for me. If something happens, you know where the papers are hid. You know what to do with them when the time comes. Watch the girl for me, if it ever comes to that. Nate Z sat very still on the floor of her own bedroom, the letter trembling faint in her hand, 12 full years of grief rearranging themselves for the second time inside a single terrible month. Because her father hadn't died out chasing rustlers across some anonymous stretch of open range after all. Her father had died standing square between Emmett Roark and the truth. And Emmett Roark, that same Emmett Roark whose men had already come twice now to her own farm, offering money for water rights with a smile that never once reached the eyes above it, was not simply some wealthy rancher expanding his own holdings out of ordinary ambition. He was the reason she no longer had a father at all. She didn't sleep that second night either. Read every letter through twice, then a third time over, piecing together a story her 12-year-old grief had been far too raw to properly assemble, and her 14-year-old fear had been far too small to face square on. Nathaniel Doss had spent the final 2 years of his life quietly gathering evidence against a rancher whose whole fortune had been built, in no small measure, on burning out smaller homesteads and buying up water rights at the point of a gun, all of it dressed up pretty as generous business. He had not once been reckless about the doing of it. Had been careful, methodical, the very same way he'd taught his own daughter to be careful and methodical with a revolver in hand. And it had gotten him killed anyway in the end. She thought of Amos then. Quiet Amos, who never once asked about her past, who farmed a stretch of land that happened. She saw it now with a clarity that turned her whole stomach to sit directly astride one of the last uncontrolled water sources, standing between Roark's spread and the mountains beyond it. She thought of what Hiram had told her out in that equipment shed. The man Amos turned away 2 full days before he died. Folks who say no to Mr. Roark have a particular way of changing their minds, or a way of not needing to know more. Coincidence? Some small exhausted part of her mind tried arguing back. Grief hunting up a villain to blame on account of a villain is always easier to carry than plain randomness, except her father's letters said this whole scheme had been running well over a decade already. Except a foreman had come to her mother's own door with a story about an ambush that never once fully added up right. Except Amos had died underneath a plow he'd checked twice, 3 times over every single day of his own careful life. Except the word kept arriving over and over, through the dark hours before dawn broke, each one chipping away a little further at whatever remained of the comfortable lie that her life had simply been unlucky rather than deliberately, carefully targeted from the start. By the time the window went gray again, Z had reached a second decision, harder even than the first. She was going to find out the whole truth of it. All of it. Even if the finding cost her the very last careful thing she still had left, standing to her name, her own carefully constructed invisibility. The sheriff's office in Larkspur Hollow sat squeezed between the mercantile and a saloon that had changed its name 3 separate times across these 7 years in that town, and never once changed the particular smell of stale beer and old sawdust that seemed to seep clean up through its very floorboards regardless. Sheriff Cyrus Vance had held the office 9 years running, and Z had exchanged maybe a dozen words with the man across the whole of that time, pleasant, forgettable words, The kind traded easy between people who share a town but nothing deeper underneath it. She went to him 2 full days after finishing her father's letters, not because she trusted the man particularly, but because there existed a proper way of doing things, and some hopeful sliver of her still believed the proper way might occasionally work out after all. Mrs. Hargrove. Vance looked up from his desk as she came through the door, and something crossed his face too quick for her to properly name it there and gone again, like a fish breaking the surface of a still pond and vanishing before a person's even sure they truly saw it. What can I do you for? I want to talk about my husband's death. The fish flicker crossed his face a second time, slower now. Terrible thing, he said. Terrible accident. I don't believe it was an accident. Vance set his pen down very carefully. Too carefully. The particular careful of a man buying himself a moment to arrange his own face before he speaketh another word. That's a serious thing to go saying, Mrs. Hargrove. It's a serious thing I've come to believe. Based on what exactly? She told him. Hiram's account of the visit 2 before Amos died. The plow linkage Amos had checked and rechecked his whole careful life through, twice now, coming right up to her own farm carrying the same offer, the same veiled threat riding underneath it. Vance listened, nodded along in all the right places. Made once she'd finished, of pulling out a battered notebook and writing something down in it, though watching close, couldn't shake the sense that whatever he was scratching out had precious little to do with a single word she'd just told him. I'll look into it, he said. When these things take proper time, Mrs. Hargrove. My husband's been dead 8 months now, Sheriff. How much more time do you require? Something hardened up behind Vance's eyes, the first honest thing she'd seen out of him since she'd walked through his door. I'd be careful, he said, dropping his voice low, about the accusations you go throwing around this town. Mr. Roark is a respected man, employs near half this county one way or another. A widow going around saying he had a hand in her own husband's death. He shook his head slow, near to pitying. That's not the kind of talk ends well for the one doing the talking. Z's spine went dead straight. Is that a warning, Sheriff? Or is that a threat? It's advice. He picked his pen back up, a plain dismissal. Free advice from a man's watched this town a good long while. Go on home, Mrs. Hargrove. Grieve your husband proper. Let sleeping matters lie. She stood there a moment longer, studying him close, the too careful face, the notebook he hadn't written a real word into, the particular way his eyes kept drifting toward the window, checking whether anybody out there might be watching this conversation unfold. And she understood, with a cold clarity settling down into her very bones like winter itself arriving, that the law in Larkspur Hollow was not going to lift a single finger to help her. Might in fact already belong outright to the very man she needed protecting from. Thank you for your time, Sheriff. Her voice came out flat, final. She left without another word, and did not once look back, and so did not see the small, folded note Vance slid into his desk drawer, the moment the door swung shut behind her, that would, inside the hour, find its way clean into the hands of a man named Cole Tatum, riding hard for the Roark ranch with word that the widow Hargrove was out asking questions she had no business at all asking. Emmett Roark's ranch house sat on a rise 2 miles east of town, built out of good lumber hauled in special from Cheyenne at considerable expense, a wraparound porch looking out over more grazing land than most territorial governors could ever hope to claim for their own. He was standing on that porch watching the sun go down slow behind the hollow, when Tatum rode in hard enough to lather his horse clean through. She's asking questions, Tatum said, not bothering to dismount before he spoke. Went to Sheriff Vance about her husband. About the accident. Roark did not turn from the sunset right away. Tall man, silver gone in at the temples, carrying the particular kind of unhurried stillness that men mistook for patience and ought rightly to have recognized, more accurate, as plain control. Which accident? He said finally, though he already knew good and well the plow. And what did Vance tell her? Told her to let it lie. She didn't take it well. Now Roark turned, his eyes pale gray, moved over Tatum with the particular scrutiny of a man reviewing a report he already suspected was coming up incomplete. Tell me about the farm, he said. Tonight, when your men rode in there. Tatum hesitated, and that hesitation told Roark near everything he needed to know already. She drew on Rafe, a gun under her skirts. Nobody saw it coming, Mr. Roark. Fastest hand I've seen on a man in 10 years. Let alone. Tatum stopped himself short, seeming to hear how that sounded out loud, and pressed on anyway. On account of the truth was the truth regardless. Let alone a farmer's widow. Roark went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, something colder than that. Something that had been waiting, longer than Tatum could possibly have guessed, for a piece of information, exactly like this one, to finally come along. Describe her, he said quietly, the way she stood, the way she held the gun. Tatum described it best he could, the stillness right before the draw, the economy of the motion, no waste movement in it at all. Like she'd done it 10,000 times before and simply chosen, until this very evening, never once to let anybody see. Roark listened without a single word, and when Tatum finished up, he turned back toward the darkening ridge, silent so long that Tatum began to wonder whether he'd been dismissed outright. Nathaniel Doswork said at last, so quiet it was near lost in the evening wind. Sir? Roark's voice had taken on a distance, a weight that Tatum had never once heard from him before. There was a range detective, worked for the Old Stockmen's Association, made a great deal of trouble for a number of ranchers in this territory. My father's outfit among them. He paused and something moved behind his pale eyes, that Tatum could not rightly name, not grief exactly. Something colder and older than grief. Before he was finally dealt with. Tatum said nothing at all. Some instinct sharp and old as any animal's, told him plain this wasn't a moment built for questions. He had a daughter, Roark went on. Girl would be, 25, 26 by now, vanished after her mother died. Association wrote her off as gone east, same as everybody else did. His jaw tightened, the first real emotion Tatum had seen cross that carefully controlled face across the 2 years he'd ridden for the man. I always wondered. Wondered what, sir? Roark's pale eyes came back around to him, and there was something in them now that made even Tatum, a man who had done a great many things in his life, he did not care to speak of, come daylight, go cold clean down to his boots. Whether Nathaniel Doss's daughter learned to shoot the way her father did. He was quiet a long moment, looking east, toward Larkspur Hollow, toward a farm sitting square on the last water source he needed to control the whole entire valley, toward a widow who had just, without either man fully understanding it yet, become something a great deal more dangerous to him than any stubborn landowner ever could be. Burn the barn, Roark said finally, voice flat. Near board, the way a man discusses ordering routine supplies house.
Not yet.
I want her frightened before I want her finished. And Tatum. Sir? If it is who I think it is, he said, then I want to know for certain before this goes any further. A woman who can outdraw Rafe Coy in her own farmyard is not a woman I intend to underestimate a second time. The fire came at midnight 3 nights later, while Z slept the first full night's rest she'd managed since Hiram Beckett stood in her equipment shed, and changed the whole shape of everything she believed about her husband's death. Toby's shout woke her first. Fire, Z! The barn's on fire. She was out of bed and into her boots before her mind had fully caught up with her body. The particular way 12 years of training lets a person move, when thinking would only cost precious seconds she couldn't spare. Revolver from beneath her pillow. Second revolver from the nightstand drawer. Both tucked away into place before she'd even crossed the bedroom threshold proper. Outside, the night sky over her barn had turned an ugly flickering orange. Toby was already down at the well, hauling water with a desperation that would do more to wear him out than the fire itself ever would, and Z grabbed his shoulder hard enough to stop him cold. The horses first. Get the horses out. The barn's lost. Toby, you hear me? It's lost already. Don't waste yourself on wood that's already burning, save what's still living. He stared at her a half-second, wild-eyed, then nodded, and ran for the barn door, and Z turned toward the tree line at the edge of her property, because a fire catching that fast, in a barn with nothing anywhere close by to spark it accidental, did not go and start itself. Someone was watching. She could feel it the exact way she used to feel it as a girl, riding fence lines beside her father in that gray hour before dawn, that particular prickle up the back of the neck that means eyes are on you from somewhere you can't yet see. She did not call out. Did not give whoever was watching the satisfaction of knowing she'd already sensed them there. She simply moved quiet, circling wide round the edge of the firelight toward that tree line, revolver steady in her hand. Every instinct her father had drilled into her across 100 patient mornings coming fully awake at once. She found the horse tracks first. Fresh. 2 riders, maybe 3, positioned at a slight rise where a man could sit and watch a barn burn and a woman scramble to save it without ever once being seen from the house below. By the time she reached the rise itself, the riders were long gone, already fled, satisfied with whatever they'd come out to accomplish, leaving behind nothing but hoofprints and a scattering of matches, half-burned, dropped in the haste of men wanting badly to be far from the scene, before anybody came looking after them. Z crouched beside those matches a long moment, revolver still in hand, watching her barn burn orange against the black Wyoming sky behind her, and felt the last soft edges of the woman she'd spent 7 years pretending to be burn away right along with it. The barn was a total loss by morning. Toby had gotten the 2 horses and the milk cow out. though he had taken a burn along his forearm doing it, that Z cleaned and bandaged with hands that did not shake, though everything else in her, that whole long gray dawn, felt like it was shaking clean through on the inside. Neighbors came by mid-morning, Hiram among them, along with a handful of others who'd heard the smoke could be seen for miles and ridden over out of that particular mix of genuine concern and plain curiosity that draws people toward any disaster that isn't strictly their own. They found the char, the ruined timber, the smell of smoke still hanging thick in the morning air. They also found Z standing right in the middle of it, jaw set, giving orders about salvage with a kind of steady competence that made more than one gathered farmer trade, a glance they didn't rightly know what to do with. Lightning? Someone asked, though everyone standing there knew good and well the sky had been clear as glass the night before. No, Z said. Wasn't lightning. Nobody asked her to elaborate further, nobody needed to. Word of Tatum's 2 visits had already made its way clean through Larkspur Hollow, the way word always did in a small town, quietly, quickly, and with just enough embellishment tacked on along the way, that by the time it reached the mercantile counter, some versions had Z holding off a dozen armed men single-handed. You ought to sell, old Mrs. Pruitt said, not patting Z's arm with that same soft, pitying pressure she'd been using at church for 8 months running now. Before it's your house next year. Nobody would think less of you for it. Z looked at the woman a long moment. Looked past her, at the ruined barn, at the smoke still curling faint up off the collapsed timbers, at the 7 years of careful smallness that had brought her exactly nowhere except a burned-out barn and a dead husband, and a whole town full of people who genuinely, sincerely believed the kindest thing left to offer her was permission to finally give up. I think I would, she said quietly. Think less of myself, I mean. If I sold. Mrs. Pruitt blinked, unsure entirely what to do with an answer that wasn't the grateful, defeated one she'd been expecting to hear. Z didn't wait around for her to find a response. She turned back to the ruin, already calculating what timber could still be salvaged, what needed hauling fresh from town, how many days of daylight stood between her and a rebuilt barn before winter made the work impossible altogether. She would rebuild. Not because rebuilding made a lick of financial sense, not with the killer's men already circling her land like wolves testing a fence line for weakness. She would rebuild because rebuilding was the answer. Because a woman who ran now would spend the whole rest of her life running. And Z Hargrove, Zarelda Doss, daughter of a man who died refusing to look away from the truth, had already spent far too many years of her one life running from exactly this particular moment. The letter took 11 days to reach him. Z knew because she counted every single one of them off. She had written it that same night. She finished reading through her father's papers sitting at the kitchen table, with the ink well gone, nearly dry, and her hand shaking through the first 2 attempts before the third one finally came out steady enough to send. Mr. Calder, you do not know me, though I believe you knew my father, Nathaniel Doss. I found letters among his things addressed to you, and I find myself in need of the kind of help I suspect you're one of very few men left living who could give. Something has come for me that I believe came for him first. If you are the man these letters describe, I would be grateful for whatever counsel you can offer. I am at the Hargrove place, 2 miles south of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Zarelda Doss Hargrove. She hadn't truly expected an answer. 12 years was a long stretch of time. Men moved on. Men died. Men who'd hung up a badge to go disappear into the mountains often did exactly that precisely because they wanted to stop ever being found by anybody. But on the 12th day, a rider came up the drive at a pace that told Z, well before she'd even made out his face proper, that this was not one of Roark's men. Roark's men rode with swagger stitched right into them. This man rode like distance meant nothing at all to him, like he'd covered 100 miles the same unhurried way he'd cover the last 100 yards up to her porch steps. He was older than she'd pictured him, 60, maybe past, gray mustache gone yellow at the edges from a whole lifetime of tobacco, eyes moving across the farmyard once, cataloging every possible threat before he'd even brought his horse to a full stop. Old Hap. Z recognized them plain because they were her own, Mrs. Hargrove. He dismounted slow, joints stiff, but his hand never once strayed far from the rifle scabbard riding on his saddle. Name's Ezra Calder. You came. Wrote me a letter with my old friend's own handwriting quoted right back at me. He studied her face a long moment, something moving behind his weathered features that looked near painful to watch happen. Lord above, you've got his eyes. Z's throat tightened around words that didn't want to come out easy. You knew him well, 20 years. Calder's voice had gone rough. Rode with him before either one of us had gray showing in our hair yet, buried more good men together than any 2 men rightly ought to have to. He looked past her, toward the scarred black ruin of the barn still half rebuilt behind the house, and something in his face hardened up considerable. And I always figured, someday, somebody was gonna come finish the job they started on him. Didn't figure it'd take this long about it. You knew he was murdered. Knew it the very day I heard how he died. Calder's jaw had gone tight. Man doesn't get ambushed on open range he's ridden 100 times before. Not a man with Nate's instincts.
Unless somebody wanted me
To look exactly that way on purpose. I said so back then. Association didn't want to hear a word of it. Told me grief was making me go seeing conspiracies in plain bad luck. He spat off to the side, a gesture carrying 12 years of bitterness folded up inside it. I quit that same month. Couldn't stomach working any longer for men who'd sooner bury a hard truth than ever face it square. Why didn't you come find me after? The question came out sharper than she'd rightly meant it to, and she watched it land on him like a physical blow. Tried, he said quietly. Rode out to your mother's place not 2 months after it happened. Found the house standing empty. Neighbors told me she'd passed, told me the girl had gone east to family. He shook his head slow. I believed them. God forgive me, I believed them, on account of believing it was a good deal easier than believing a 14-year-old girl had gone out into that whole territory all alone with nothing to her name. Z said nothing for a long moment. There was no anger left in her for this old man, standing in her farmyard with guilt written plain into every line of his weathered face. Only a strange aching gratitude that he'd come at all, 12 years late, on account of 12 years late, still beat never arriving at all. I'm here now, he said. Whatever's found you, Mrs. Hargrove, you tell me the whole of it, and we'll see between us what's to be done about it. She told him everything that same afternoon, sitting out on the porch while Toby fed the horses down in the half-rebuilt barn, working close enough to listen without being told to and far enough off to seem, should anybody ride up unexpected, like he wasn't listening at all. Smart boy through and through. Calder listened the exact way her father used to listen, still, focused, asking questions only what change would truly change what he understood, rather than simply filling up silence for its own sake. When she reached the part about Roark's comment, my father's outfit among them, Calder went very quiet indeed. Emmett Roark's father was Silas Roark, he said finally. Ran cattle in this territory well before Emmett ever took the operation over proper hard man. Meaner than a cornered badger and twice as unpredictable with it. He rubbed a hand slow over his jaw. Silas died 8-9 years back now? Heart give out, or that's the story that got told anyhow. Emmett's run the whole outfit since, so it was the father. Not the son. Could be. Calder's eyes had gone distant, working back through old memory like a man sorting through a deck of cards. Or could be the son gave the order himself and let the father wear the blame of it down in the county's memory, on account of nobody goes questioning a dying man's sins the same way they'll question a living one's. Either way.
He looked at her steady.
Either way, the son's out there finishing whatever the father started. That much I'd stake my own life on. He's the one sent Tatum to my farm. He's the one wants your water bad. And now, if what you're telling me about that gunfight in your yard holds true. Calder's expression darkened further still. He's the one about to figure out exactly whose daughter he's dealing with here. And Emmett Roark did not get to where he's standing today by leaving loose ends lying around a valley he means to own outright. Z looked out over her half-rebuilt barn, over the fence line her father never once got to lay eyes on, over 200 acres that had already cost her a husband and very nearly her own carefully guarded secret besides. Then I suppose, she said, we'd best finish rebuilding that barn before he decides to go and burn it a second time through. Something that was near a smile moved beneath Calder's gray mustache, the very first one she'd seen out of him yet. Your father used to say something just like that, he said. Word for word, near enough it about stopped my own heart hearing it out of you. What did he say? Said the man who burns your barn once is only testing you. Man who burns it twice already knows the answer and just wants to sit back and watch you suffer for it. Calder's eyes had gone hard again. Old lawman's eyes, calculating and cold clean through. So we make good and certain there isn't any second time coming. We get ahead of him. Toby found her alone in the kitchen that same evening, after Calder had ridden off to take a room at the boarding house in town, close enough to reach the farm fast should trouble come calling, far enough off not to draw immediate suspicion from anybody keeping an eye on the place. He's really a marshal? Toby asked, sliding into his chair at the table. Eyes still a touch wide from the whole afternoon's revelations. Was. Long time back, and your pa was one too. Not exactly, something close to it. Toby chewed on that a while. Chewed on the bread she'd set in front of him. Chewed on the whole enormous shape of everything he'd overheard that afternoon without ever once being properly invited to hear a word of it. Why didn't you ever tell me? he asked finally. Not accusing, just young and a little hurt. In that particular way, boys got when they discovered the person taken them in had a whole hidden life running along underneath the ordinary one they'd been shown. Z sat down across from him, considering the question with a good deal more care than its size might have rightly suggested it deserved. Because telling people things, she said slowly, has a way of costing you, dear. I learned that a long time back. Learned it the hard way, same as I expect you've learned a few hard things yourself, long before you ever climbed up into my hayloft. Toby's jaw tightened, and for a moment she pushed on somewhere he wasn't yet ready to go near. My padre, he said finally, like the words had been sitting behind his teeth a good long while waiting on somewhere safe to land. Hit my ma till she left him. Then hit me till I left too. He looked down at the bread in his hands like it had gone and gotten awful interesting all of a sudden. Didn't tell you that either. Figured it wasn't your business to go carrying. Something in Z's chest ached, sharp and sudden. It's fine, he said it too fast. The way people say fine when it very much isn't. Just saying. We're maybe not so different is all. Both of us carrying things quiet like. She reached across the table and set her hand over his, and he let her, which was its own small miracle coming off a boy who flinched at sudden movement more often than he'd probably ever own up to. I'm glad you climbed up into that hayloft, she said quietly. I'm glad you didn't go and chase me back out of it. Something loosened up in her chest, not quite a laugh but close kin to one. The first easy feeling she'd had in weeks running.
Toby.
Yeah? Whatever's coming, and I believe something is coming. Something bigger than one barn fire. I need you to know plain you're not obligated to stay through it. You're 16 years old. You could ride on to Cheyenne. Start yourself up somewhere new. Nobody would think one thing less of you for it. He looked at her like she'd gone and suggested something faintly ridiculous. You'd think less of me, he said. I would not. You would. Just wouldn't ever say it out loud. He picked his bread back up, chewing with the particular stubbornness of a boy who'd already, silently, made up his own mind about something and had no plan whatsoever of being argued back out of it. Besides, somebody's got to keep hauling water for that half-built barn while you're off out drawing gunslingers in the yard. This time she did laugh short, surprised more leaf riding in it than any real humor. Fine, she said. Fine. But you listen to Calder same as you'd listen to me, you hear? Man's forgotten more about staying alive out here than either one of us has learned yet in our whole lives. Yes, ma'am. And Toby? Thank you for staying put. He didn't answer that one directly. Just nodded, one eyes gone a little too bright, and went back to his bread, and Z let him keep the silence. On account of some things were better left unsaid than said clumsy, and she suspected rightly. As it turned out later that this particular boy had already had plenty enough clumsy words thrown at him over one lifetime already. 2 weeks passed in the uneasy quiet that comes right before a storm that everybody can already feel building on the horizon, but nobody can yet put a name to the exact hour of. The barn went up, board by board. Calder's steady hands and Hiram Beckett's borrowed labor speeding along what Z alone could never once have finished before winter closed the whole thing down. Tatum's men did not return to the farm itself through those 2 weeks, a fact that worried Z a good deal more than it reassured her, on account of absence. In a war shaped like this one, rarely meant surrender. It meant regrouping, plain and simple. She spent those 2 weeks doing the 2 things her father had taught her better than anybody else alive could, watching and waiting. Practicing her draw at dawn behind the new barn frame, where the fresh-cut lumber still smelled sharp of sap and the echo of gunfire wouldn't carry far enough to reach the county road. Sitting up late with Calder over coffee gone cold, piecing together, letter by letter, exactly how deep Roark's corruption ran clean through Larkspur Hollow the sheriff bought outright. The county assessor quietly persuaded to look the other way on water claims filed a season too late to be strictly legal. 3 other homesteads besides her own, and Amos is quietly pressured into selling over the past 2 years alone. He's not only after your water, Calder told her one such night, spreading a rough hand-drawn map of the whole valley out across her kitchen table. He's after the entire valley. Your creek's the last piece standing between him and it. Every other water source between the hollow and the mountains already runs clean through land he owns outright. And if I don't sell, then you're the one obstacle standing between Emmett Roark and being the richest, most powerful man in this whole territory. Calder's eyes met hers, steady and grim. Man like that doesn't lose gracefully, Z. He's already burned your barn once through. Killed your husband, most like, and my old friend before him besides. I don't expect he's finished by a long stretch. Then we don't wait around for him to come again. Calder studied her a long moment. What are you thinking on? I'm thinking Amos needed supplies for that barn roof, nails, shingle stock. I'm thinking I go into Larkspur Hollow myself, in broad daylight, in front of the whole entire town, and I do it without hiding one single thing left about who I truly am anymore. Her jaw set, and for a moment the resemblance to the man in those old letters ran so strong Calder had to look clean away from her. I'm done being small, Ezra. If Roark wants to see exactly what he's dealing with here, I intend to let him see it in front of every witness this town has got standing. Calder was quiet a long moment, turning that over slow, weighing the risk of it against the particular stubborn set of her jaw that told him plain this decision had already been made and no amount of caution was fixing to unmake it now. Then I ride with you, he said finally. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He folded the map slow, deliberate, doing it anyway. Your father asked me once to watch out for you, should it ever come to it. I let 12 years slip clean by without keeping that promise proper. Don't intend on letting one more day pass the same careless way. The morning she rode into Larkspur Hollow, the sky over Wyoming Territory carried that particular high, hard blue that only ever showed up in early autumn, the kind of blue that made everything sitting underneath it look sharper, exposed, like the whole world had gone and decided to stop offering up any place left to hide. Fitting, Z thought, guiding her horse down Main Street with Calder riding a careful half-length behind her, close enough to matter should trouble come, far enough back to let her walk into this whole thing on her own 2 feet. She felt that Tom's eyes find her before she'd gone 20 yards down that street. Felt that particular quality of attention that comes off people who've already heard the rumors running the gunfight out in her yard, the fire, the questions she'd put to Sheriff Vance that Vance himself had apparently not kept nearly so quiet as she'd once hoped he might. Whispers followed her past the mercantile, past the bank, past the saloon with its 3 different names and one single unchanging smell trailing out of it. She did not lower her eyes, did not hurry her pace one bit. Walked through that whole gauntlet of curiosity, the same unhurried way her own father used to walk into rooms full of men who wanted him dead. And something about that particular, deliberate steadiness seemed to unsettle the watchers a good deal more than any outright show of fear ever could have managed. She was 3 doors shy of the feed store, saddlebags already half loaded with the shingle nails she'd come for, when the sound of horses turned her head toward the far end of Main Street. 6 riders, coming in slow, so deliberate, spread wide clean across the width of the road in a formation that had nothing whatsoever to do with casual travel and everything to do with plain intimidation. At their front, a big, broad through the chest, a thin white scar cutting clean through his left eyebrow, Cole Tatum, though Z had never once seen him without his hat pulled down low the way it sat now, riding forward with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to seriously consider the possibility of losing. Calder's hand drifted casual toward his rifle. Easy, Z murmured, not looking his way. Let's see first what he's come for. The 6 trits drew up in the middle of Main Street, close enough now that the whole town had gone still around them, shopkeepers pausing mid-transaction right in their own doorways, a woman pulling her child back sharp from the boardwalk's edge, old men out on the hotel porch setting down their pipes to watch it unfold. Dust, kicked up by 6 sets of hooves, began settling slow over the packed dirt of the street, hanging there in the high autumn light like it was waiting on something particular. Like it already knew. Mrs. Hargrove. Tatum's voice carried easy across the space between them, pitched loud enough for the whole watching street to catch every word of it. Mr. Roark sent us to make you one final offer. Generous as ever. His smile did not reach his eyes, had never once reached his eyes in any of the times she'd seen it worn. This don't have to go hard. Z set her saddlebag down slow on the boardwalk beside her, freeing both her hands, and stepped down off the boardwalk into the street itself, into the open, into the dust, into the full weight of 6 armed men and one entire town's held breath. Tell Mr. Roark, she said, voice carrying just as easy, just as clean across that waiting street, that I already gave him my answer twice through now. I don't intend to give it a 3rd time from any farther away than this exact spot. Tatum's smile thinned some. Careful now. I am being careful, Mr. Tatum. I'm being exactly as careful as a woman needs to be. When 6 armed men ride into her town to threaten her in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, on account of the man who sends them hasn't got the plain courage to make his own threats to my face direct. A murmur moved through the watching crowd, not quite approval, not yet, but something close kin to it, something that had not once existed for Z Hargrove in this town before this exact moment arrived. Tatum's jaw tightened. His hand drifted, deliberate, toward the grip of his revolver. This don't have to go hard, he said again, quieter. and something underneath the words had shifted from threat towards something closer to genuine warning, as if some part of him, some old instinct, sharpened up by whatever he'd already heard about the farmyard confrontation, weeks back, was already recalculating whether this particular morning was fixing to go the way he'd planned it out. Z's hand did not move toward her own gun, not yet. Because her father had taught her, out on a stretch of open range that no longer existed anywhere but memory, that the last thing a person did before violence broke loose was often the thing that mattered most of all, and she was not about to give this street, this town, this whole watching world the satisfaction of seeing her draw first. Then don't make it hard, she said quietly. Turn around, ride back to Emmett Roark. Him, the daughter of Nathaniel Doss, said no. The name landed in that street like a gunshot all its own. Somewhere behind her, she heard Calder's low, sharp intake of breath, not surprise at the name itself, but surprise that she'd finally said it out loud. In public, in front of a whole town that had spent 7 years believing her nothing more than a quiet farmer's widow. Tatum's eyes went wide, just for a heartbeat, before something colder and a good deal more calculating slid back down over his face. Doss, he repeated low. That's right, well. His hand had stopped its slow drift toward the holster. Stopped and hovered, 2 inches shy of a decision that would go and change everything about how this particular story got told for years afterward in every saloon and church pew between here and Cheyenne. That does change things some. The whole street had gone silent. Even the wind, restless as it always ran in this country, seemed to have paused a moment just to listen. Z's own hand hovered, just as red, 2 inches shy of her hip from a place where a farmer's widow should have had nothing but an apron pocket and 11 cents to her name, and instead held 12 years of patient, deliberate, unforgiving training behind it. Last chance to ride away, Mr. Tatum, she said, voice level, unhurried, carrying clean across the waiting dust of Main Street. I'd take it were I standing in your boots for one long suspended heartbeat. Not a soul in that street moved a single inch. Not the horses, not the watchers pressed back into doorways up and down the block. Not the 6 armed men whose whole entire plan for this ordinary autumn morning had just come apart clean in their own 2 cents, not Z. And in that silence, in that one held breath stretched taut clean across the whole width of Larkspur Hollow's Main Street, everything that had happened up until then, every quiet morning, every buried letter, every careful year of small, deliberate invisibility, gathered itself together into one final, waiting moment. Tatum's hand moved, Z's hand moved faster. The shot cracked across Main Street like a whip, snapping the whole sky clean in half, and Cole Tatum's revolver spun clear out of his grip before it had even fully cleared the leather, clattering across the packed dirt to land somewhere down near the feed store steps, his hand jerking back with a howl carrying more shock in it than pain. She had not hit him, had never once intended to. The bullet had found the gun itself, the frame, just above his own fingers. A shot demanding a stillness of hand and a certainty of eye that not one soul on that whole street, save perhaps Ezra Colt, fully understood the impossible precision behind. A shot that could just as easy have taken Tatum's fingers clean off with it, had her hand trembled by so much as one hair's width. It hadn't trembled at all. Silence again, deeper this time, broken only by Tatum's ragged breathing and the frightened stamp of some startled horse down the line of riders. Next one won't miss whatever it's aiming at. Z's. Into that silent voice, as calm and unhurried as if she were remarking plain on the weather. Ride home, Mr. Tatum, and tell your Mr. Roark that Nathaniel Doss's own daughter doesn't scare near as easy as a farmer's widow used to. For a long moment, Tatum simply stared at her, chest heaving, hands still curled tight around the sting of that near miss, eyes doing uncomfortable math on just how badly he'd misjudged this entire encounter from the start. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached down and retrieved his fallen revolver up out of the dirt, holstered it without one further word, and turned his horse around. The other 5 riders followed, dust rising thin behind them as they rode back the way they'd come in. And this time not a soul in that watching street mistook their unhurried pace for anything but exactly what it plainly was. Retreat. Sheriff Cyrus Vance arrived 11 minutes later, long after the danger had passed clean through, long after Tatum's men had cleared the far edge of town, long after half of Larkspur Hollow had already begun spilling out of doorways and storefronts to crowd around the spot in the street where a farmer's widow had just, in full view of God and everybody, shot a gun clean out of a hired killer's hand. 11 minutes. Z counted those too, same as she counted most everything these days. What in God's name happened here? Vance's voice carried a good deal more alarm than authority, a good deal more concern for his own standing than for anybody who might have gotten hurt in the doing. Mr. Tatum and 5 of Mr. Roark's men rode into town to threaten me, Z said, before anybody else could go, offering up a version of events more favorable to the sheriff's evident preference for confusion. In front of this entire street, Sheriff. I expect there's no shortage of witnesses standing here, should you finally decide to do something with the lot of them. A ripple of agreement moved clean through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable all the same. Hiram Beckett's voice up above the rest, steady and sure of itself. She's telling it true, Cyrus. Watched the whole thing from the hotel porch myself. Tatum drew first, she only went and defended herself. Vance's eyes flicked across the gathered faces, the mercantile owner, the blacksmith, old Mrs. Pruitt with her hand pressed flat to her own chest. A dozen others nodding right along with Hiram's account of it, and something in his expression tightened with the particular discomfort of a man realizing, in real time, that the story he'd been counting on to control had just gone slipping decisively clean out of his hands. I'll look into it, he said finally. That same tired phrase he'd offered Z 2 weeks back in his own office, and this time it landed out in front of the whole town, carrying every bit of the hollow weight it truly deserved. You do that, Sheriff, Z said. And while you're looking, you might ask yourself why Emmett Roark's hired men keep finding fresh reasons to ride onto my property and into your town with guns drawn, and why the law in Larkspur Hollow hasn't managed yet to find one single reason to stop them at it. She did not wait around for any answer. She turned, retrieved her saddlebag of shingle nails from off the boardwalk where she'd set it down, and walked back to her horse with the same unhurried, deliberate steadiness she'd carried into that street to begin with, while behind her, Vance stood alone in the settling dust, notebook still closed up in his hand, surrounded by a town that had just watched, for the first time in 7 long years, exactly what kind of woman had been living quiet among them the whole time. They rode home in silence the first mile, the autumn light going golden low clean across the plains, and it was Calder who finally broke it. Your father, he said, would have been proud of that shot. He'd have told me I flinched a half-second too long before I drew. So. A ghost of a smile moved beneath the gray mustache, but he'd have been proud all the same underneath the criticizing. Z said nothing for a while, watching the road unspool ahead of them, feeling that particular strange lightness that came from finally, after 7 years, setting down a weight she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying every single day. It's not over, she said eventually. You know that plain as I do. He'll come harder now that he knows who I truly am, he will. Calder's voice had gone grim again, the brief warmth of the moment before folding back down into old lawman's caution. A man like Emmett Roark doesn't back down off a public humiliation, Z. He absorbs it whole, waits a spell, comes back around with something a good deal worse than 6 riders and 1 loud threat. Then we'd best be ready for worse. They rode the rest of the way home without further speaking, the farmhouse rising up into view at last against the darkening ridge, smoke curling thin and familiar from the chimney where Toby had kept the fire going all through that long, uncertain afternoon. He was waiting on the porch when they rode in, having clearly heard some early, breathless version of the story already carried out from town by a neighbor's boy on a fast horse, and the look on his face when Z swung down from her saddle sat somewhere between terror and plain awe. You shot a gun right out of his hand, he said, voice cracking clean on the last word, in the middle of Main Street in front of Sentire Town. I did. Z. He shook his head slow, like he was trying to fit the whole enormous shape of it into a space far too small to properly hold it. You're not just a farmer's widow at all, are you? She looked at him a long moment, this boy who had climbed into her hayloft 4 months back, carrying a silence she'd recognized without needing to ask. This boy who had chosen, that very same evening at her kitchen table, to stay put and haul water rather than ride off safe from whatever storm was building. No, she said finally, honest. The last of the old careful smallness settling away off her like dust after a long hard ride. I don't suppose I ever really was at that. That night, after Toby had finally gone on up to the loft, and Calder had ridden back toward his room at the boarding house, to keep watch on whatever word might travel through town before morning broke. Z sat alone at her kitchen table, with her father's letters spread out before her in the candlelight, reading through them once more, slower this time, hunting for anything she might have missed in the frantic, grief-stricken haste of that first terrible night. She found it near the very bottom of the stack, a final letter, dated only days before her father disappeared for good, the ink gone slightly smudged where his hand must have moved too fast clean across the page. Ezra found something today changes everything. Not just about Roark's water schemes, bigger than that by a good margin. Papers showing money moving through this territory that shouldn't rightly be here, railroad money, tangled up close with land claims going back years and years, and Roark's own name threaded clean through the middle of the whole mess. If something happens to me before I can bring this proper to the association, the papers are hidden where only Z would ever think to look. She'll know the place should she ever come to need it. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her everything I taught her. I taught her so she'd never once need anybody's rescue but her own. Nate Z sat very still in the candlelight, the letter trembling faint in her hand, her mind already turning back through 12 full years of memory toward a hiding place her father had shown her only the once. Back when she was small enough that the memory had near faded entire beneath everything that came piling on after it, a place only she would ever think to look. Somewhere out past the north pasture, at the base of a rock formation her father used to call the Old Sentinel, where he'd once buried something down inside a tin box and told a 9-year-old girl, half in jest and half in some deeper instinct she was only now beginning to properly understand, that it was a secret just between the two of them. Whatever her father had found, whatever proof of Roark's schemes he'd uncovered in those final days of his, big enough and dangerous enough that he'd hidden it, rather than simply reporting it up proper, was still out there somewhere. Waiting, 12 years waiting on a daughter who was at long last, finally ready to go and find it for herself. Z folded the letter carefully, set it back among the others, and looked out through her dark kitchen window toward the shape of the ridge beyond her fields, black now against a sky gone thick with stars, toward a hiding place that had sat undisturbed through 12 years of grief and 7 years of careful, deliberate smallness both. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she would ride out and finally find what her father had died protecting. She did not yet know that Emmett Roark, standing out on his own dark porch 2 miles east that same night, silver head bowed low in fury over the humiliation of Main Street, had already given an order of his own, an order that would reach the Old Sentinel long before Z Hargrove ever could hope to. What the ground still remembered before sunup, before the rooster crowed, before even the coffee had finished boiling black on the stove, Z already saddled. Because there was waiting on this one, no sitting with it easy over breakfast, turning it slow in her mind the way she turned most everything else through. Her father's letter said the papers were hidden, where only she would ever think to look, and if she could work that much out by candlelight across one long sleepless night, then Emmett Roark's men carrying enough money and enough motive between them could work it out too, maybe already had. Which meant every hour she spent hesitating was an hour that might already have run too late.
You didn't sleep?
Calder's voice low behind her in the gray half-dark of the yard. He was saddled too. Had been apparently, well before she'd even come out herself. Neither did you. No. He swung up his horse, wincing at the old ache in his hip that never quite let a man forget his own years. Figured you'd be riding at first light whether I came along or not. Figured I'd sooner ride beside you than go chasing after. Smart man, stubborn man. There's a difference. Some days, and ain't one of the days it applies. They rode north in silence, the sky behind them going that same bruised purple it always went, the same color that had opened the very first morning of this whole terrible unraveling months back. Toby had wanted to come along. Z had told him no flat, immovable, and left him at the farm with strict instructions and a loaded rifle and a promise that she'd be back well before dark set in. She meant every word of that promise. Whether the world was going to let her keep it stood as an entirely separate question. The Old Sentinel stood where it had always stood, a single broken finger of gray rock jutting up out of the plain a half-mile past the north pasture fence line, older than the farm, older than the town itself, older, Z suspected, than anything else standing in this whole hard country. She remembered it from a morning 17 years back now. 9 years old, small hand swallowed whole inside her father's own, watching him kneel down at the base of that stone and dig a shallow hole with his bare hands while he told her, in that particular voice he used for things he meant a good deal more seriously than he ever let on, that a smart man never hides his secrets somewhere obvious. Hides them somewhere a person has to already know to go looking. She reached the base of the rock formation with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it clean up in her own teeth, and for one long, terrible moment, she simply sat her horse and stared down at the ground, unable quite to make herself dismount. Because what if it's already gone? Because what if she'd ridden all this way out here on nothing but a dying man's 12-year-old hope and found only an empty hole where the last of her father's truth used to sit waiting? Z. Calder's voice. Steady. Grounding her. I know, she said, I'm going. She swung down, knelt at the base of the stone, exactly where her memory told her to kneel, and began digging with hands gone cold, clean through despite the morning's mild chill. 6 inches down, 8. Her fingers struck something hard and metallic, and her breath caught so sharp it near hurt her. The tin box came up out of the earth, rust-streaked but whole. The lid stuck fast with 12 years of packed Wyoming dirt, and Z sat back on her heels in the pale morning light and simply held it a moment. Both hands wrapped tight around it like it might up and vanish should she loosen her grip one bit. "Open it," Calder said quietly. "Or I feel should your hands not manage it." Her hands worked barely. A folded stack of papers, oilcloth wrapped against the damp, and beneath those, a small leather ledger gone soft with age. She unfolded the papers. First, land claims, water filings, bank drafts carrying names and dates that meant nothing at all to her at first glance, until Calder, reading over her shoulder with the sharp, practiced eye of a man who'd spent 20 years learning to read exactly this particular kind of trouble, went very still beside her. "Lord above. Railroad money." His finger traced down a column of figures, jaw gone tight. "Coming in through a Cheyenne bank, moving straight into land purchases clean through this whole valley. Every homestead ever got burned out, every water claim ever got jumped. There's a payment sitting right here matching each one through dates, amounts, the whole works. Roark. Roark's own name's on half of it outright." Calder's voice had gone hard, grim, the old lawman surfacing full now beneath that tired gray mustache of his. "But look here." He turned the ledger toward her, tapping one entry with a blunt finger. Z read it twice. "Roark payment authorized, that endos matter settled in full." "Silas," she breathed out. "His father signed off by Silas." "But look close at the hand that wrote the receipt sitting underneath it." She looked, younger handwriting. Cramped, hurried, but unmistakably a signature she'd already seen twice before, once on a deed filing dated 3 years back, once on a letter of complaint against a homesteader Calder had pulled fresh from the county recorder's files just the week before. Roark Emmett, not merely his father's son inheriting a sin he'd had no hand at all in. His father's accomplice 12 years back. Old enough already, at the time, to authorize a payment that had, in some fashion neither of them could yet fully prove but both now fully believed, bought her father's silence, the only way men like the Roarks had ever known how to truly silence anybody. "He was there," Z said very quietly. "He was part of it, all along, the whole time. Looks that way plain. He let me believe." Her voice caught sharp, on something that wasn't quite grief anymore. Something a good deal colder. "He stood right on my own porch and let his men make me an offer. Knowing full well exactly whose daughter he was making it to. I expect he did know." Z sat there a long moment, papers trembling faint in her hands. 12 years of half-formed grief finally hardening down into something carrying a name and a face and a signature written out in ink gone brown with age, until a sound reached her, distant but entirely unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Several, coming fast from the direction of the county road. Calder was already moving, already sweeping the papers back into the oilcloth, already reaching for his phone. "We need to go. Now this instant." She did not need telling twice through. They made it back to the tree line at the edge of the north chapter before the riders crested the rise behind them. 4 men. Z counted quick, moving at a hard gallop straight toward the very spot she and Calder had just abandoned. And she understood, with a cold certainty settling down into her chest like ice water, exactly how close this whole thing had come. Minutes. That was all that had stood between her and finding nothing but an empty hole in the ground where her father's truth used to sit. "They knew," she said, watching the riders reach the old sentinel and begin tearing at the earth with a violence that told her plain everything about how badly Roark wanted whatever she now carried tucked safe inside her coat. They knew right where to look. Somebody told them. Calder's face had gone grim clean through. Or somebody's been watching this farm a good deal closer than we ever realized. Z thought of Sheriff Vance's 2 careful eyes drifting toward his own office window. Thought of the note she'd never once seen him write. The one that had somehow found its way clean into Cole Tatum's hands within the hour of her leaving that office weeks back. "Vance," she said. "Could be. It is." Her jaw set hard. "There's no could be about it any longer, Ezra. Everyone in this county supposed to protect me has already gone and to decide which side they're standing on. And it isn't mine, not one bit of it." They rode the rest of the way home in silence, paper and ledger safe inside Z's coat, the weight of them a good deal heavier than paper had any rightful business being. Cole Tatum was not by his own nature a man given much to sleepless nights. He had done a great many things across his life he did not examine too closely. On account of examining them too closely was a habit that got a certain kind of man killed, either by his own conscience or by the men who paid him well not to keep one. He'd ridden with Roark's outfit 4 years running now. Had burned barns before this one. Had put fear into more homesteaders than he cared rightly to count and told himself, each and every time, that it was simply the job, and the job was simply money. And money did not require a man to go losing sleep over how exactly he'd earned it. Until 3 nights back. Until the name Doss had landed clean in the middle of Main Street like a gunshot all its son, and something old and buried deep in Cole Tatum's own memory had cracked wide open right along with it. He was 19 years old the first time he ever met Nathaniel Doss. 19, half-starved, running hard from a rustling charge that would have hanged him just as surely as it hanged the 2 older men he'd fallen in with that particular fall. Doss had caught him alone, 3 miles off from the herd, gun already drawn, already fully justified in every legal sense to bring him in dead or alive, whichever suited. He had looked at 19-year-old Cole Tatum a long, considering moment, then lowered his gun slow and said something Tatum had never once, in 15 years since that day, managed to fully shake loose from his memory. A boy that's scared of dying still got room left in him to change. Go on now. Get gone from this territory. And don't let me catch you doing something stupid enough that next time through I won't have myself a choice in the matter. He'd ridden 200 miles that same week, and never once looked back over his shoulder. Built himself a different life for a while, before circumstance and bad luck and a whole series of choices he wasn't proud to own, brought him eventually back around to this same territory, working for a man whose money ran good and whose conscience, Tatum had long since learned to simply ignore did not. He had not thought of Nathaniel Doss in years and years. Had not until 3 nights back, ever once connected the quiet, dangerous, unaccountably steady-handed widow out on the Hargrove farm to the very lawman who'd once let a scared, guilty 19-year-old boy ride free instead of hanging him proper. Now he could not stop thinking on it no matter how he tried. Sat in the bunkhouse that night, whiskey going warm and untouched clean through in his hand, and turned the whole impossible coincidence over and over until it stopped feeling anything like coincidence at all, and started feeling a good deal closer to a debt he'd never once expected to be called on to answer. "You're quiet tonight." Rafe Coy, still nursing his own wounded pride from the farmyard weeks back, dropped himself onto the bench across from him. "Roark's madder than a scalded cat, is what I hear. Sending word out for more men, real gunslingers, this time through. Not just ranch hands who happen to carry a pistol on their hip. How many more? 10, maybe a dozen." Rafe shrugged, indifferent, the particular way a young man shrugs off things too large for him yet to fully understand the weight of carrying. "Says he's done playing at this whole business. Says the widow made a fool clean out of him in front of the entire town. And he means to make good and certain nobody in this territory ever sees fit to laugh at Emmett Roark again." Tatum's grip tightened hard around the untouched glass. Because 12 more guns meant this was no longer some matter of scaring one stubborn woman clean off a piece of land. 12 more guns meant Roark intended to finish once and for all what his own father had started. And Cole Tatum, who had spent 15 years running hard from the memory of a debt he'd never once expected to have to repay, was about to find out exactly what kind of man he'd gone and become across all that running. Sheriff Vance's office had never once, across all these years in Larkspur Hollow, felt quite so small as it did that particular morning. She and Calder walked into it carrying 12 years of buried proof between the two of them. "I want this file," Zeus, laying the oilcloth-wrapped papers down flat on his desk, with a deliberate, unhurried precision that dared him plain to look away from them. "Territorial marshal, county recorder, whoever it rightly takes. This is evidence of fraud and murder against Emmett Roark, going back well over a decade now." Vance did not reach for the papers. That more than anything else told her every last thing she needed to know. "Where'd you come by these?" he asked, voice fully flat. "Does it matter?" "It matters a great deal, Mrs. Hargrove. Should you be asking me to act on evidence that might have been obtained irregular? My father buried them before he was murdered for finding them," Z said, each word landing hard and slow. "I'd call that obtained honest. Wouldn't you say the same?" Something shifted behind Vance's eyes, not quite guilt, but something close kin to it. The particular discomfort of a man who spent so long looking away from a truth that being asked now to look at it direct physically pains him some. "I'll need to revise," he said finally. "Proper through the appropriate channels." "You mean you'll need to ride on out to Roark's ranch and hand them straight back to the very man they incriminate? That's a serious accusation to make." "So is murder, Sheriff. And I've had my fill these past weeks of watching you find every reason under God's own sky not to take one seriously." Vance's jaw tightened, and for one long moment, Z thought he might actually reach for those papers. Might actually go and do the honest thing a badge was supposed to obligate a man toward. Instead his hand drifted slow, deliberate, toward the drawer at the edge of his desk, the very same drawer Z realized with a cold jolt running through her, where he'd once slid a folded note the moment her back had turned away from him. Saw it too. I would, the old marshal said quietly, rifle already half-raised, and something in his voice sold certain, entirely without a shred of doubt in it made Vance's hand freeze exactly where it sat. Get out of my office, Vance said low, all pretense of cooperation finally, mercifully abandoned. Both of you. Before I have the both of you arrested for threatening an officer of the law. We're leaving. Z gathered the papers back up, tucking them once more inside her coat. A good deal safer there than they'd ever be sitting in this compromised little office. But you ought to know something first, Sheriff, before we go, and what's that copies? Her eyes held his, steady, unflinching clean through. Ezra rode to Cheyenne last week and had these copied out by a lawyer he trusts entire. Filed with the territorial court under seal, so whatever happens to me, whatever happens to these particular papers writing in my coat, the truth's already out of your hands, Sheriff. And out of Roark's too. It was in point of fact entirely true. Calder's own idea 3 nights back. Made while the ink of the discovery still sat fresh in their minds. A man who spent 20 years learning exactly how corruption goes about protecting itself does not walk into a compromised sheriff's office without carrying some manner of insurance first. Vance's face went pale clean through. You're bluffing. Ride to Cheyenne and find out for certain. They left him standing there, frozen behind his own desk, and did not look back once, though Z felt his eyes on her the whole way out the door and down the boardwalk, felt the entire shape of what she'd just done settle into place behind her like a lock finally, decisive, turning itself shut for good. Emmett Roark received word of the courthouse filing that same evening, delivered by a writer Vance had sent out in a state of undisguised panic, and for the first time across the 4 years Tatum had written for him. The man's carefully cultivated calm cracked clean straight down the middle. Filed, Roark repeated, voice dangerously quiet, standing in that same spot on his porch where he'd given the order to burn Z's barn weeks earlier. Under seal. With the territorial court itself. That's the word come down, sir. Then it no longer matters one bit whether she's still got the original papers on her. Roark's pale eyes had gone flat, calculating, running rapid through consequences. Tatum could see arriving behind them already like weather rolling in fast off the mountains. Doesn't matter should I burn every last page of that evidence myself this very night. It exists now, filed and certified proper, and should I not finish this before some circuit judge decides to take a particular interest in a decade-old ledger? He did not finish out the sentence, did not need to. 12 more men, Roark said instead, turning full toward Tatum, and something in his face had shifted clean from cold calculation into something closer to raw, uncalculated fury, the particular fury of a powerful man tastes, for the first time in years, the real possibility of losing everything at once. I want them here by tomorrow night. Every gun I can buy anywhere in this territory, Tatum. I don't care one bit what it costs me. We end this. Roark's voice had dropped down to something near gentle, near soft, which was, Tatum understood with a chill settling low in his gut, somehow a good deal more frightening than any shouting could ever have managed. All of it, the widow. The old marshal sniffing round my business. That boy she's taken in, should he prove fool enough to still be standing there when we arrive. His pale eyes fixed hard on Tatum's own, and whatever remained of his careful public patience had gone somewhere dark and entirely final. Nathaniel Doss's daughter humiliated me in front of this whole entire county. Tatum, I intend to make certain she's the very last soul in this territory who ever lives long enough to tell that particular story twice through. Tatum stood very still on that dark porch, feeling the weight of an old debt pressing harder against his chest than it had in 15 full years of careful, deliberate forgetting. Understood, sir, he heard himself say. But somewhere underneath the words, in a place Roark's money had never quite managed to fully purchase off him, Cole Tatum had already begun quietly, dangerous, to understand something else entire. That whatever happened out at the Hargrove farm come tomorrow night, he was no longer entirely certain which side of that particular gunfight he intended to be standing on when the shooting started. Z felt it before she rightly understood it, that particular stillness settling down over the land at dusk, the wind dying off to near nothing at all, the birds gone quiet in the cottonwoods along the creek in a way that Toby, watching from the porch beside her, noticed. Something's wrong, he said quietly. I know it. How do you know? She didn't answer right away. Stood instead at the porch rail, watching the eastern horizon where the last light was bleeding, slow out of the skies, gone the color of an old bruise, and let 12 years of her father's careful training tell her plain what her eyes alone could not yet fully confirm. Because the land goes quiet, she said finally, right before something's about to go and break it wide open. Calder rode in 20 minutes later, face grim in the fading light, and Z knew, before he'd said one single word, exactly what he'd ridden over to tell her. Roark's calling in every gun money can buy, he said, swinging down off his horse with none of his usual careful stiffness moving, instead with the sharp, economical urgency of a man who'd spent his whole life preparing for a night exactly like the one now bearing down on all of them. 12 more men. Maybe more still by the time they're through gathering. He means to end this, Z. All of it once and for all. Tomorrow night, best I can rightly piece together. Z stood very still on her own porch, in the last dying light of an ordinary autumn evening, and felt the whole shape of the last 8 months, the grief, the letters, the papers buried and unburied 12 years apart gather itself together into one single, unavoidable point bearing down hard on this farm, on this family she had built almost without ever meaning to, out of one boy who'd climbed into her hay loft and one old marshal who'd finally kept a promise, 12 years too late in the keeping. Then we don't wait around for tomorrow night, she said quietly. We use every hour we've got left before it arrives at our door. Because there would be no more retreating left in her. No more small careful invisibility left standing to hide behind. Whatever was coming down on Larkspur Hollow, whatever final, terrible reckoning Emmett Roark intended to bring crashing down on this quiet piece of Wyoming ground, was going to arrive and find a farmhouse standing entirely ready for it. Z. Hargrove intended to make good and certain of that herself with her own 2 hands. You're doing it wrong. Toby's, half offended, half amused, cut clean through the cool evening air behind the barn where Z had set up 3 tin cans on a fence rail and handed him a rifle a good deal heavier than his own stubborn confidence had led him to rightly expect. I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. You're flinching. I'm not flinching. You're flinching before you even squeeze the trigger, Toby. Your whole shoulder pulls back like the gun's already gone and bit you. She stepped in behind him, adjusted his stance with 2 firm hands, the same patient correction her own father had given her out on a range that no longer existed anywhere but memory. Breathe out. Let the shot happen between heartbeats. Don't go chasing after it. He tried again. Missed by a wider margin than before, and swore under his breath in a word that would have gotten him swatted good at church. This is flat impossible. It's not. It's only new. Z's voice gentled just slightly. I missed my first 40 shots too when I was starting out. 40? Give or take a few. You're only saying that to make me feel better, Toby. She met his eyes, steady, serious, clean through. Tomorrow night men are going to ride onto this farm meaning to kill every last one of us standing here. I am not going to lie to you about how hard that's going to be. On account of a lie won't go and save your life out there when it counts. But I am going to stand right beside you and make good and certain you're as ready as 4 days can ever make a person. Something in his face went very still. The bravado draining slow out of it, leaving underneath a fear he'd been working hard, all evening, to keep from showing plain. What if I can't do it, he said quietly. What if it comes down to it and I just freeze up solid? Then I'll be right there beside you. Same as Ezra will be. You won't be alone in it, not for 1 sec. She squeezed his shoulder once, brief grounding. Nobody expects you to turn gunslinger overnight, Toby. I just need you steady enough to load, to cover a window, to do exactly what we practice until it stops being something you have to think on and starts being something your hands just plain know how to do. He nodded, jaw tight, and raised the rifle back up again. This time, when he fired, the middle can spun clean off the rail. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before he let out a whoop that cracked halfway through with something sitting between triumph and plain disbelief, and Z watching him. This boy who'd climbed into her hayloft with nothing but a stolen blanket, and a silence she'd recognized without ever needing to ask, felt something in her chest twist tight with a fierce, protective love she hadn't let herself fully name until this exact moment arrived. Again she said, voice gone rough. Let's see whether that was luck or learning taking hold. Turned out to be a measure of both. But by the time full dark forced the 2 of them back toward the house, Toby had put 4 out of 10 rounds somewhere close enough to matter. And something in the set of his young shoulders had changed entire, not fearless exactly, but no longer near so alone inside his own fear either. Hiram Beckett's porch light was still burning when Z and Calder rode up his drive well past supper hour, and Sold Farmer met them right at the steps, with a lantern held high and worry already carved deep into his weathered face. Heard talk in town, he said, before Z had even dismounted proper. Roark's bringing in gunmen, dozen or more, some folks are saying. It's true, every word. Hiram's jaw tightened. He was quiet a long moment, the lantern light flickering shadows across features that had watched this valley through 20 hard winters running. I helped carry your husband's coffin up that hill, Z. His voice had gone rough clean through. Should have spoken sooner about that plow. Cost you 8 months you didn't have call to spend not knowing the truth of it. I don't intend on making that same mistake twice through. Hiram, I'm not asking you, or no, you're not asking. He cut her off, gentle but firm about it. That's exactly why I'm offering it up myself. Roark's had his boot pressed down on this valley long enough now. Burned out the Delaney place 2 years back, ran the Whitfields clean off the year before that, and half this county's been too scared or too beholden to say one word against it the whole while. His eyes met hers, steady in the lantern light. I've got a rifle and 40 years of knowing this land better than any hired gun Roark's bringing in fresh from Cheyenne. You'll have it, and me besides, whenever those men come calling on you. Calder nodded slow beside her, something close to approval moving across his own weathered face. I'll ride to the Petersons' place tonight, Hiram went on. And the Coopers after that. There's more folks in this valley carrying a grudge against Roark than he's ever once bothered counting up proper Z. Man like that always forgets how many enemies quiet suffering can add up to right up until the night it finally comes due on him all at once. Z felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, not with a dozen gunmen still bearing down on her farm come tomorrow night, but something close kin to it. That particular unfamiliar warmth of discovering that 7 years of careful smallness had never actually left her quite so alone in this valley as she'd once come to believe. Thank you, Hiram. Don't thank me yet. He managed something near a smile, grim as it came out. Thank me to after still be standing upright to do it proper. They rode home beneath a sky gone thick and black with stars, the particular clear, cold Wyoming night that made every sound carry twice as far as it rightly should. And Z found herself thinking, unbidden, of her father's voice out on a range that no longer existed anywhere but memory, patient hands closing warm over small ones, teaching her that a weight carried long enough does eventually learn how to settle lighter on a person's shoulders. She had carried this alone 7 long years running. She would not, she understood now, watching Calder ride steady beside her, and thinking on Hiram already saddling up fresh to spread word through a valley full of quiet grudges, be carrying it alone come tomorrow night. That would have to be enough to see them through. It would have to be, on account of by this same time tomorrow, Emmett Roark intended to arrive at her farm carrying everything money could buy, meaning to finish once and for all what his own father had started 12 long years back, and Z. Hargrove, daughter of Nathaniel Doss, did not intend to give him the satisfaction of finding her one bit less than ready for it. Cole Tatum did not sleep that particular night either. Lay instead on his bunk, staring up at the rough plank ceiling of Roark's bunkhouse, listening to a dozen new hired guns settling themselves in all around him, men he didn't know from Adam, men carrying the particular flat, unbothered eyes of gunslingers who'd long since quit counting up the graves trailing behind them. Men who would ride onto that farm tomorrow night and see nothing whatsoever but a payday waiting. He was not one of them any longer. Had not been, he realized now, for a good deal longer than he'd ever let himself properly admit. Because a debt stayed a debt, whether a man wanted to go on honoring it or not. Because Nathaniel Doss had looked square at a scared, guilty 19-year-old boy with a rope waiting on him and chosen Circe instead of the law's own easy certainty. And because the daughter of that mercy was about to get buried under 12 armed men, unless somebody riding inside Roark's own outfit found the nerve within himself to do something about the matter. He thought on riding out right then, straight through the dark to the Hargrove farm, to warn her plain. Except riding out meant Roark would know within the hour, sure as sunrise. Meant every other man in that bunkhouse would be told, come morning, that Cole Tatum had turned traitor on the outfit, and a farm warned early with 1 extra gun standing was still a farm facing down 12. Wouldn't tip the scales near enough to matter one way or the other, would only cost him whatever thin advantage his position inside Roark's outfit still afforded him going forward. So he lay there instead, turning the old debt over and over through the dark, waiting on tomorrow night to arrive at last, telling himself, though not rightly believing it yet, not fully, that he'd know the exact right moment when it finally came calling. That when the gun started up for real, he would find out, once and for all, exactly which side of this whole fight Cole Tatum had been riding toward the entire time without ever quite letting himself see it plain. The last debt in the valley full dark. No moon worth speaking of. Just stars hard and cold and endless, watching down over a farmhouse that had spent the whole afternoon turning itself into something a good deal closer to a fortress than a home. Z stood at the upstairs window with a rifle across her knees and her father's 2 revolvers loaded and ready on the sills beside her, watching the tree line where the county road cut clean through the north pasture, and felt that particular stillness settle down over the land like a held breath, right before violence breaks it wide open, because there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to plan out further. Every window boarded halfway, leaving a gap wide enough to shoot clean through and narrow enough to make a body a harder target for anybody shooting back. Every door barred fast. Hiram Beckett and 2 of his sons posted down at the barn, rifles ready in their hands. The Coopers dug in behind at the stone wall of the wells, as Ezra called her downstairs at the front window, steady as ever despite the stiffness that had crept into his knees across 20 years of exactly this kind of long cold waiting, and Toby at the side window, rifle trembling faint in his young hands, despite 4 whole days of practice, despite every word of steadying comfort Z had offered him at supper just an hour before. "You'll do fine," she'd told him then. "You don't know that for certain." She'd met his eyes. Honest on account of honest was the only thing worth offering a boy standing right at the edge of his first real gunfight. "But I know you showed up regardless, and showing up's most of it, Toby. The rest we'll figure out together, same as always." He hadn't answered back, just nodded, jot, and gone off to his post. And now Z sat at her own window, listening to the wind move slow through the cottonwoods, and waited on the sound that would tell her everything was about to change forever. It came a little after hoofbeats, many, coming hard down the county road, no longer bothering one bit with the pretense of caution, on account of Emmett Roark had decided, somewhere across the last 24 hours, that caution no longer served his purposes at all. "Riders," Calder's voice low and carrying clean up the stairwell, 12. Maybe more still coming up behind them. Z's heart hammered once hard against her ribs, then went dead still. Because this was the exact moment her whole life had been quietly, patiently training her toward. Whether she'd ever fully understood it or not, every dawn out on the fence line, every patient hour with her father's steady hands closed warm over her own small ones, every year of careful smallness that had finally, this one particular night, run in, completely out of road position, she called down, voice level, carrying clean through the dark house with the same unhurried authority her own father used to carry into rooms full of men who wanted him good and dead. "Hold your fire till they're past the tree line proper. Let them commit to it first." Silence answered her back. The particular silence of people too frightened to speak up and too determined to run. Then the first rider crested the rise that's against the starlight, and the whole night broke open at once all together. Because here was the thing nobody ever bothered telling you about waiting on a gunfight before it starts. It was never the fight itself that truly tested a person through and through. It was the minutes standing right before it. The stretch of silence where a mind's got nothing left to do but go and imagine every last possible way the coming hour might turn out wrong on you. Z's mind did exactly that, crouched low at her window, watching torchlight bob and multiply along that tree line below. What if Toby freezes solid? What if Calder's bad knee gives out at the worst possible second of the whole night? What if this turns out to be the exact night 12 years of careful patience finally runs clean of its luck? Stop it, she told herself hard. Just stop right there. Breathe out slow, let the thought pass on through, same as you'd let a shot pass between 2 heartbeats. Except stopping a fear shaped like that one was never quite so simple as her father's old lessons had made it sound out loud. Not when the fear wore a boy's face on it. Not when it wore Calder's own stubborn gray mustache on it. Besides, Z. Toby's voice small driftings over from the next room. You still there? Still here? Promise me you won't. Promise you won't go and do anything foolish out there. Trying to protect me from it. I promise to do exactly what needs doing, Toby. Same as I'd ask the very same of you tonight. That's not rightly a promise. No, she admitted. And something in her chest ached fierce and sudden at the plain honesty of saying it out loud. It isn't at that. It's the only true thing I've got left standing to offer you tonight. Silence a moment, then his voice again. Steadier than it had been before. Okay, I'll take the true thing over the easy one, any day of the week. A pause. Guess that's something else you went and taught me, without ever once meaning to. She didn't have the time left to answer him proper. The torches had already reached the fence line. The first shot came out of the barn. Hiram, or one of his boys, firing off a warning that went wide but sent the front rank of riders scattering hard for cover behind the fence posts. And after that there was no more careful counting left to do. Just noise, just muzzle flash cutting the whole darkness into fragments too fast to properly follow. Just the particular chaos of a gunfight at night, where every shadow might turn out an enemy and every enemy might turn out only a shadow. And a person's whole survival comes down clean to trusting the hands they've trained up for exactly this one moment. Z fired from the upstairs window, steady, economic, Every shot placed with the same patient precision her father had drilled into her across 100 quiet mornings long past. Not to kill, where she could help it none. To pin down. To scatter wide. To buy her small outnumbered defense every extra second it could possibly get out of the darkness. Except precision only bought so much against 12 armed men who did not share 1 ounce of her restraint. A bullet tore clean through the window frame 6 inches shy of her shoulder, spraying splinters that caught along her cheek, sharp and stinging. And somewhere below her Toby's rifle cracked twice in quick succession, too fast, too frightened, both shots going high and wild off into the dark beyond. Toby. She didn't dare leave her post to go check on him proper. Could only shout sharp, cutting clean through the chaos around them both. Breathe. Same as we practiced. Slow it down now. A pause. A ragged breath she could hear even over the gunfire rolling on. Then a third shot, steadier this time, and a cry from somewhere out past the fence line that told her plain it had found something solid. Good boy, she thought, fierce and aching all at once together, and turned her whole attention back to the fight closing in tight around them. Because a night battle carries a rhythm all its own, one that Z's father had tried, more than once across the years, to describe to her proper and never quite managed the doing of. You cannot see it coming, he'd told her once. You can only feel it start to shift underneath you. It shifted now, muzzle flash from behind the well house. A shout cut off sharp. Hiram's oldest boy dragging his younger back behind the water trough after a graze along his forearm that would need stitching, but nothing worse. Thank God for that much mercy. Nothing worse than that. The Coopers holding their line with the grim, unhurried competence of men who'd spent a whole lifetime protecting exactly this kind of hard-won ground from exactly this kind of threat, and Z moving now from window to window, room to room, a blur of steady hands and colder nerve than any of the men in this valley had ever thought to credit her with carrying. She caught one rider trying to flank the porch and put a bullet clean through his gun hand before he'd even cleared the fence, proper, precise, deliberate, more mercy folded into it than the man rightly deserved, and more restraint than the moment strictly demanded of her. Because she had promised herself, sometime across the long sleepless nights leading up to this one, that she would not go and become the very thing she was out here fighting against. Would not let Roark's own cruelty reshape her into something as careless with other lives as he had always, every single time, proven himself to be. Even now. Even here. Even with a dozen guns all aimed square at everything she loved most in this world. It cost her something, that restraint of hers. Cost her precious seconds she could have been simply ending threats outright instead of merely disabling them one by one. But it was a cost she'd decided, long before the very first shot ever cracked across her farmyard tonight, that she was fully willing to go on paying. It was Calder who fell first down below. She heard it before she rightly understood what she was hearing, a grunt, sharp in pain, drifting up from downstairs, followed by a heavy, wrong sound that could only be a body going down hard against bare floorboards. Ezra, I'm alive. His voice, strained, coming up through the stairwell thin and tight with real pain. Shoulder. Just my shoulder took it. Keep your position, Z, don't you dare come down here after me. She came down anyway. 2 steps at a revolver in one, heart lodged up in her throat, and found him slumped against the wall beneath the front window, blood already soaking dark clean through his shirt, rifle still gripped tight in his good hand, like sheer stillness alone might manage to keep him upright a while longer. You're no use to me bleeding out on my own kitchen floor, she said, voice gone rough, already tearing a strip free from her apron to press hard against the wound. Wasn't planning on bleeding all the way out, just slowing down some is all. A ghost of his old dry humor, even now, even here in the middle of it. Your father'd tell you the very same thing I'm about to say. Don't stop fighting on my account, Z. This farm needs you standing upright a good deal more than it needs you kneeling down beside one old man. She wanted to argue that wanted more than near anything else in that terrible, splintered moment, to simply sit right down on that floor and hold pressure against his wound until the whole world outside stopped mattering to her one bit. Except the world outside was not about to go and wait around on her grief tonight. Hold this, she said instead, pressing his own good hand down firm over the makeshift bandage. Hold it tight now. I'll be back for you. She was on her feet again before he could argue it further, moving back toward the stairs, toward the fight still raging on outside her own walls, and did not let herself look back once, because looking back, in that exact particular moment, would have cost her every last thing the moment still demanded of her right then. Cole Tatum had not fired a single shot the whole night through. Had positioned himself, deliberate, at the rear of the whole assault, close enough to seem properly engaged, Far enough back to avoid the particular reckoning he'd spent 3 sleepless nights running, failing to resolve down inside his own conscience. Until the moment he saw Rafecoy circling wide around the barn's blind side, moving low and fast toward the side window where a 16-year-old boy stood alone, rifle already spent dry, hands scrambling desperate to reload with fingers gone clumsy clean through from terror. Rafe's revolver came up level. And something in Cole Tatum, something buried 15 years deep down, something a scared 19-year-old boy out on a dark range had once been given free and clear by a man who owed him not one thing in this world finally, breakably, broke clean loose inside him. Rafe. His own shot cracked out across the yard before he'd even fully decided to go and fire it, and Rafecoy went down hard in the dirt, revolver skidding clear out of his hand, alive still but out of the fight for good and all. Silence sharp and sudden from the nearest knot of Roark's hired men standing close by Tatum. One of them, a stranger among the 12 fresh guns, stared at him with dawning, disbelieving fury written plain across his face. "You just shot your—" "He's not my own." Tatum's voice came out steadier than he felt inside, steadier than he had any rightful claim to feel. Standing there in the middle of a gunfight he'd just gone and switched sides of entire. "None of you ever truly were, not really, not once." The stranger's gun swung round toward him fast. Tatum's was already faster still. Because 15 years of hard living had taught him a great many things he wasn't proud to own up to, but it had also, somewhere along that whole long road, taught him exactly how to survive a moment shaped like this one, and when the smoke finally cleared off, it was the stranger lying still in the dirt, and Cole Tatum standing alone in the middle of the chaos, breathing hard, having just gone and burned every last bridge back to the only steady paycheck he'd known across 4 solid years. He didn't regret the doing of it. Would have plenty of time later on to wonder over why that surprised him so little in the end. Word of Tatum's defection tore clean through Roark's remaining men within minutes, flat chaos compounding chaos. The tight, disciplined assault Roark had paid handsome money to arrange fracturing into something a good deal more ragged and uncertain by the second, and Z, watching from the porch with a revolver steady in each hand, felt the whole tide of the fight begin slow, painfully, to turn at last. Not one outright. Not yet, not by a long stretch, but turning sure enough. Hiram's sons had pinned down 4 riders behind the barn proper. The Coopers had driven back a flanking attempt out at the well house entire. And somewhere out past the fence line, a boy who 4 days back had never once fired a rifle in true earnest was holding his own position with a steadiness that made Z's chest ache clean through with something a good deal fiercer than plain fear. Except the fight itself was not over yet. Because the last rider, the one who had held back from the whole assault entirely, watching from a rise a quarter-mile off with 2 men flanking him close, silver hair catching faint starlight beneath the brim of an expensive hat, finally, deliberately, began riding down slow toward the farmhouse himself. Emmett Roark had come out to finish this personal with his own 2 hands. He rode in alone in the end of it, his 2 remaining men held back at his own gestured command. Some final vestige of pride refusing outright to let this last confrontation turn into anything other than exactly what it had always, secretly, truly been between them from the start. Personal through and through. Z met him out in the yard, revolver steady at her side, the chaos of the larger fight fading round them both into something distant and unimportant now. The whole night narrowing itself down to one single stretch of packed dirt between a farmhouse and the man who had spent 12 long years, one way or another, trying to erase her whole family clean out of this valley. Mrs. Hargrove, racist, even carried that same practiced calm, though something beneath it had gone thin and brittle, stretched right near to breaking apart entire. Or should I say, Miss Doss? Either one will do fine. You've cost me a very great deal tonight, I'll say that plain. You cost my father his own life 12 years back. Her voice did not shake. Had not shaken once through everything this whole night had already demanded of her. I'd say we're a long stretch from even yet, Mr. Roark. His hand drifted toward his holster. Slow, hers was already there waiting. Don't, she said quietly. I've beaten faster men than you tonight already, more than once. Don't make me go and prove it out a second time through. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, at the steady revolver, at the stillness running through her whole stance that no amount of money or violence had managed to shake loose all night long, and something behind his pale eyes finally fully cracked wide open. My father built everything I have standing on the ashes of men like yours, he said low, near to himself. I was 22 years old when he told me plain what needed doing about Nathaniel Doss. 22 and too much a coward in my own heart to tell him no. His jaw worked hard, old guilt surfacing at last after 12 years of careful practiced denial. I've spent every single year since making certain nobody ever once found out how much of a coward I truly was underneath it all. You could have stopped it. Any year at all, Mr. Roark. You could have chosen a different road entire, I know that. His voice cracked, just slightly on the admission of it. I know that a good deal better than you could ever hope to understand. Standing where you stand. Silence stretched out between the two of them, heavy with everything 12 years had cost a father, a husband, a whole valley full of quiet grudges finally coming due together all at once. Roark said finally, hand hovering, voice gone rough with something that was not quite bravery, and not quite despair either. Finish it out. Should that be what you've ridden all the way here to do tonight? Is that truly what you want? Doesn't matter anymore what I want. Hasn't, going on 12 years now. No, Z said. I don't suppose it has at that. Z's finger rested steady against the trigger. Except steady was a strange word entire for what was truly happening down inside her chest in that exact moment. Because underneath the stillness, underneath 12 years of careful training, something in her was screaming plain to just end it right there. End him outright and every last ounce of grief he'd caused with one clean pull of her finger. And then something else rose up quicker. Older by far. She thought of her father's voice out on a range that no longer existed anywhere but memory. A weight carried long enough learns, eventually, how to settle lighter. She thought of Amos, buried on that hillside, dead for the simple crime of refusing to sell what was rightfully his own. She thought of a tin box buried 12 years down in the ground, papers inside it, that could do a great deal more lasting damage to Emmett Roark, done proper and right, than any single bullet ever could hope to manage. No, she said. Roark blinked, thrown clean off balance, some part of him having plainly braced himself for an ending a good deal more final than the one she was now offering him instead. No? Because killing him now, she thought would be easy. Almost too easy by half, and easy was never once the thing her father had truly taught her to go reaching for. In a moment like this one, I'm not going to kill you, Mr. Roark. Her voice had gone quiet, steady, carrying a weight that had nothing left to do with the gun still sitting in her hand. I'm going to arrest you instead. Same as the law should have gone and done 12 years back had the law in this territory ever once found the courage in itself to do its own plain job. You've got no authority to arrest anybody at all. I don't. A figure stepped out from the shadow of the porch, revolver drawn, a badge catching faint starlight on his coat. Ezra Calder, pale from blood loss but upright all the same, having dragged himself clean off that kitchen floor, through nothing but sheer force of will. But I served 20 years as a United States Marshal in this territory, Mr. Roark, and that commission's never once been formally revoked on me. I'd call that authority enough standing for one particular night. Roark's face went slack and tired, the last of his composure finally, completely, abandoning him for good. This isn't over, he said, grasping at a threat that had already lost every last particle of its old power over anybody standing there. No, agreed, it isn't over, not by a stretch, but it's about to get settled proper in front of a territorial judge, with 12 years of your own ledgers laid out plain for the whole county to see with their own eyes. She holstered her revolver, deliberate, the fight finally fully, draining clean out of her shoulders at last. That's a far worse ending for a man like you than any quick bullet could ever have managed, Mr. Roark. I suspect you'll have yourself a great deal of time to sit and consider that particular truth, wherever they end up sending you off to. By the time the last of Roark's hired guns broke and scattered off into the dark, Tatum's defection, and Roark's own capture for having done a good deal more to shatter their resolve than any amount of return fire ever managed alone, the eastern sky had already begun its slow climb back up toward gray. Z found Toby kneeling down in the dirt beside the fence line, rifle finally lowered, hands shaking now that the fight no longer required them. Steady, he said, voice small, staring at a spot out in the grass where one of Roark's men lay groaning, wounded proper but very much alive still. I actually hit him clean, you did. She knelt down beside him, pulling him into an embrace neither one of them rightly had the words to properly explain, both of them shaking now that there was finally room left to. You did exactly what needed doing tonight, Toby. And not one single thing more than that. Is that supposed to feel as bad afterward? Every single time, she said quietly. For every decent person who's ever once had to go and do it. That feeling right there's how you know you're still exactly who I always believed you to be. Dawn found the farmyard littered with the whole debris of the night's violence, scattered shell casings, a splintered fence rail, 3 of Roark's hired men bound and guarded close by Hiram's sons until a wagon could be arranged to carry the lot into town for the territorial marshal to sort proper. None of Z's own people had died through the whole of it. A miracle Calder would call it later on, though Z privately suspected it owed a good deal less to plain luck than to 12 years of careful preparation finally meeting its own true moment head-on. Hiram found her down by the well, washing the last of the night's grime and blood off her hands in water gone pink and cold clean through. "Your father would have been proud this morning," he said quietly. "Whatever he was to you, Z, whoever he truly was. Underneath it all, I expect he'd have stood right here in this yard and known exactly what manner of daughter he'd gone and raised up. You knew, didn't you? She didn't look up from the water. Before Main Street. Before any of this whole business? Suspected some." He crouched down beside her, weathered face gentle in the gray morning light. "A man doesn't farm alongside somebody 7 years running without noticing certain things. The way you watched that tree line every single morning. The way you never once flinched at a snake in the grass. The way half the women in this valley surely would have. I didn't know the particulars of it. But I knew plain you were carrying something a good deal heavier than any farmer's widow ought to have to carry alone. Why didn't you ever ask me straight out? Same reason you never told me, I'd expect." He offered her a tired, entirely genuine smile. "Figured it wasn't rightly mine to go asking after. Figured you'd tell it when you were ready, or you simply wouldn't, and either way you'd still be my neighbor and my friend regardless." His eyes crinkled, warm despite the exhaustion carved deep into every line of his face. "Turns out I was neighboring a legend the whole while. County's going to be telling this one for years running, Z. Mark my words on it." Calder survived his wound barely, according to the doctor who rode out from town at first light, but survived all the same and spent the following weeks recovering out on Z's own porch, cantankerous and impatient, more than once, reduced to grudging tears by the sight of neighbors riding in daily with food, with lumber, with the particular gratitude of a valley that had finally, after years of quiet fear, watched somebody stand up square to Emmett Roark and win. "You're supposed to be resting," Z told him. The third time she caught him trying to help Toby stack fresh-cut lumber for the new barn, with one arm still bound tight against his own ribs. "I am resting. This here's my particular version of it. Your version of resting looks a great deal like plain disobeying doctor's orders. Doctor's 26 years old and's never once had to sit still while a whole war finished itself off around him. I'll take his advice on setting bones proper. Not on how a man's meant to spend his own convalescence." He grunted, easing himself down onto an overturned crate with as much dignity as a healing gunshot wound allowed a person. "Besides, somebody's got to keep an eye on that boy's aim. Getting downright cocky since the siege." "I heard that," Toby called down from atop the half-built frame above. "Meant for you to hear it." Z watched the two of them a long moment, the old marshal and the boy he'd started, somewhere across the exhausting weeks since the siege, to treat a good deal less like a stranger's charge, and a good deal more like something close kin to family. Felt a warmth settle down into her chest that no amount of grief, old or new, had managed to fully touch in a very long while. Sheriff Cyrus Vance didn't survive his own reckoning quite so gentle. Faced with a sealed court filing, a wounded federal marshal's sworn testimony, and an entire valley's worth of witnesses no longer afraid to speak plain, he resigned his badge within the week, rather than face the territorial inquiry that followed close after. He came to the farm once, before he left town for good. Stood awkward at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in his hands, unable quite to meet Z's eyes direct. "Want to say I was sorry," he said finally. "For all of it, the whole affair, the office, the note I sent along to Roark's man. Every time I told you to let sleeping matters lie, when I already knew good and well those matters weren't sleeping at all. Why didn't you help me, Cyrus? Any one of those times you had the chance, scared." The word came out rough, honest in a way she'd never once heard from him, across 9 years of pleasant, forgettable exchanges. "Roark had his hand in half this county's business, one way or another. Mine included, if I'm being plain about it. Man like that makes fear feel a whole lot like common sense, right up until the moment it stops feeling that way entire." Z studied him a long moment, found, somewhere underneath 12 years of hardened grief, that she had no interest of standing in cruelty toward a man already so thoroughly undone by his own conscience. "I hope wherever you land next," she said finally, "you find it easier to be brave in. Might save somebody else the 8 months of not knowing that your own silence cost me dear." He'd nodded once, and ridden clean out of Larkspur Hollow that same week with nothing but a single trunk lashed to his saddle, a small justice, Z thought, watching him go. The barn raising came the first Saturday after the season's first hard frost, and half the valley turned out proper for it, more folks than Z had ever once seen gathered together, in one place outside a funeral or a wedding. Wagons lined 3 deep along her drive. Children chasing each other clean through stacked lumber, while their fathers hauled beams, and their mothers laid out more food than any farmhouse table could ever rightly hope to hold. Hiram Beckett ran the work crew with the easy authority of a man who'd raised a dozen barns across his time, shouting good-natured orders that nobody much minded taking off him. And by sundown the frame stood tall and square against a sky gone gold with the last of that autumn's light. Never once seen a town turn out like this for anybody, Calder observed, watching from a bench somebody had dragged out for him, still not rightly trusted with any heavy lifting. Wasn't always like this. Z handed him a plate of Mrs. Pruitt's pie, still watching the crowd with something close to wonder she hadn't yet fully gotten used to feeling. For 7 years I don't believe half these people could have told you my given name straight off. Things change, given times, things do. She watched Toby scramble up a half-finished beam, laughing at something one of Hiram's boys had shouted up at him. Careless in a way she hadn't seen out of him since well before the siege took hold. Others just finally get their chance to be what they always were underneath it all along. Calder was quiet a moment, chewing thoughtful. Been thinking, he said finally, about riding come spring. Territorial Marshal's office up in Cheyenne's been asking after me lately. Seems my old commission's still worth something after all these years gone by. Something in Z's chest tightened, unexpected and sharp. You'd be sorely missed round here, figured I would be, a ghost of his dry smile. Which is exactly why I've also been thinking I might tell them no straight out. Might tell them this old lawman's got exactly as much unfinished business right here as anywhere else standing in this whole territory. More probably, given how much trouble the two of you seem plain determined to keep finding your way into. We didn't go looking for trouble, Ezra. No, his eyes had gone soft, watching the barn crew hoist the last beam up into place against the darkest sky above them. But trouble's got a particular way of finding folks worth fighting for. And I find I'm not in any special hurry to be off somewhere else when it does come calling again. Z didn't trust her own voice to answer that one proper. Just reached over and squeezed his good shoulder once, and let the gesture say what 12 years of careful, hard-won family had never once quite needed spoken plain out loud between people who already understood the whole of it regardless. Emmett Roark's trial held that winter in Cheyenne drew reporters from as far off as Denver itself. Z attended 3 full days of it, sitting in the second row beside Calder, still favoring his healing shoulder, still stubbornly refusing anybody's offer of a more comfortable seat, and listened close as a territorial prosecutor laid out 12 years of fraud and violence with the same patient precision her own father had once brought to tracking rustlers clean across open range. The charges, read out plain on the very first morning, covered both killings square Nathaniel Doss, ambushed 12 years back on a stretch of range he'd ridden 100 times over, and Amos Hargrove, crushed beneath a plow he'd checked 3 times a day his whole careful life through. 2 men 12 years apart, both them silenced the same way for the same stubborn refusal to look away from the truth. Roark did not testify in his own defense at any point, sat instead at the defendant's table with his silver head bowed low, the last of his careful composure finally, completely, gone from him, while witness after witness Hiram Beckett, 3 other homesteaders Z had never even known shared her exact same grievance. A Cheyenne banker who'd quietly kept records of every irregular transfer for years out of his own private unease over the matter, assembled a case so thorough clean through that the jury took less than 2 hours total to reach their verdict. Cole Tatum's testimony came on the second day, delivered in a voice steadier than Z had ever once heard out of him, describing without a single request for leniency the order Roark had given to burn her barn, the 12 extra guns hired on for the night of the siege, and the debt, spoken aloud finally for the very first time, that had turned him at last against the only steady paycheck he'd known across 4 solid years. Why change sides, the prosecutor asked him plain, after 4 years standing in Mr. Roark's employ. Tatum was quiet a moment, finding Z's own clean across the courtroom. Because I owed her father my whole life, he said simply. And I figured it was well past time I started living like a man who properly remembered that debt. Nobody in that courtroom, watching him step down off the witness stand, mistook the weight coming off his shoulders in that moment for anything less than exactly what it plainly was. The jury convicted Emmett Roark on charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy that would keep him behind territorial walls for the whole remainder of his natural life. He was led out of that courtroom without one word, without once lifting his eyes to meet Z's own, and she found, watching him go, that she felt neither triumph nor any real satisfaction in the watching. Only a long quiet exhale, 12 years finally allowed to properly end. Tatum himself left Larkspur Hollow not long after the trial closed out, once the last of the winter's business with the court had been settled proper. Offering no explanation beyond a quiet nod to Z out on the road leading north. Debts paid was all he said to her. It was never rightly a debt you owed me, she told him. It was one you owed my father. I'd say you've settled it plenty, and then some besides. He'd ridden off without another word north, toward mountains that swallowed him clean from view within the hour. And Z never learned exactly where that particular road eventually carried him, only that somewhere out there, a man who'd spent 15 years running hard from an old mercy had finally, at considerable cost to himself, found a way to properly repay it. Spring came slow to Wyoming Territory that following year the way it always did in that country, but it came all the same. The new barn stood finished by then, sturdier than the one it had replaced, and the North Pasture Creek ran clear and unclaimed by anybody but the family it had always rightfully belonged to. Larkspur Hollow itself had changed some too, in the quiet way small towns change, after they've watched something true finally win out over something powerful and cruel. The women at church no longer pressed Z's hand with that same soft, expiring pity they'd once carried. Old Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, had taken to bringing a second pie along to every gathering specifically for Toby, on account of a boy who'd stood his ground clean through a gunfight deserved, in her own word, at least that much fuss made over him proper. Even the mercantile owner had started extending credit without being asked first. A small unspoken apology for 7 years spent watching a struggling widow and never once offering her more than pity in return. Z filed the formal adoption papers for Tobias Wren on a bright morning that April, standing beside him at the county recorder's office in a town that had, across one long, quietly stopped whispering behind her back and started offering something a good deal closer to plain respect instead. You don't have to go and do this, Toby said, for perhaps the 10th time that whole week, still not quite able to believe it was truly real. I mean, I already live with you, already call you. He stopped, coloring some. Well, I already think of you as say it plain. As my sauce? Like the words still cost him something dear to spend. Some days when I let myself think it through, then I want the paper to say it too. She squeezed his hand once, brief, fierce. Not on account of it changing what's already true between the two of us, Toby. On account of I want the whole territory to have to answer to it. Same as I've had to answer to being Nathaniel Dawsos's daughter my whole life through. I want you protected by a good deal more than just my own say-so. He'd cried some, signing his own name for the very first time as Tobias Hargrove, and pretended after that it was only the spring pollen bothering his eyes some, and Z had let him keep that small, dignified lie for himself, on account of some things a person needs to be allowed to feel, without an audience watching too close on them. On a quiet evening that same spring, she rode up alone to the hillside overlooking the north pasture, where two graves sat side by side beneath a young cottonwood, just beginning to leaf out fresh her husband's, and beside it, a marker she'd had carved and set that same winter past, empty of anybody but full, at long last, of everything her father had ever deserved and never once received in his own lifetime. Nathaniel Dawes' beloved father, honest man, he carried the truth until it could finally stand on its own. She knelt there a long while, the evening wind moving soft and warm clean through the new grass, and set one of her father's old revolvers gentle against the stone. Not a burial, not quite that, but something close enough to peace that the difference no longer seemed to matter much at all to her. We made it, she said quietly, to the wind, to the white, patient sky, to 12 years of grief finally fully, allowed rest easy at last. Took a good deal longer than either one of us figured on. But we made it through all the same. Behind, faint on the evening air, she heard Toby's voice calling up from the farmhouse below, cheerful and unafraid in a way that still, someday, caught in her chest like a small, private miracle all its own and beyond him, Calder's answering laugh, and the ordinary, precious sounds of a home that had finally, after everything it had cost to build, earned its own true measure of quiet. She rose, brushed the dust from her knees, and started back down the hill toward it, toward all of it waiting on her below. Because that was the whole truth about buried grief in the end. Sooner or later, if a person carried it far enough, if they refused to set it down before the carrying was rightly through, the weight did exactly what her father had always promised her it would. It settled lighter, never fully gone, not grief-shaped like that one, but lighter, carryable at last. The particular kind of lighter that let a person finally set a burden down, long enough to build something new, standing on the very ground where it used to sit, a home full of noise and healing, a family chosen same as it had chosen her right back, a farm that belonged, at long last, to no name in this world but her own. The daughter of Nathaniel Doss walked on down toward the lights of that farmhouse waiting below, toward the boy who was hers now in every single way that mattered most, toward the old friend healing slow out on her porch, toward a life she had finally fully earned the right to go on living out loud, in the open, under her own true name.